Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where strange ideas get comfortable, old mysteries stay up a little later than they should, and the unknown is invited to sit quietly by the fire for a while. Tonight, we are easing into one of those subjects that seems to live halfway between science fiction, whispered testimony, and the sort of late-night speculation that sounds either completely ridiculous or oddly reasonable, depending on how tired you are. We're talking about Nordic aliens. Not the big-eyed grey visitors that usually dominate the conversation, not glowing monsters from old pulp magazines, and not little green anything. These are the ones described as tall, calm, pale, beautiful, almost suspiciously well put together, as if someone designed an extraterrestrial race by asking a 1950s contactee, a fantasy illustrator, and a shampoo commercial director to collaborate under mysterious circumstances. Before we get into any of that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now. Maybe it's late, and the house is finally quiet. Maybe it's early, and the day has not yet fully decided what mood it's in. Maybe you're listening with the lights off, wondering why humanity seems unable to simply invent normal mysteries. If you find this soothing, intriguing, or just a nice way to unwind for a little while, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this little corner of calm reach more people who enjoy drifting off to ancient questions, strange theories, and stories that are just unusual enough to make sleep a little more interesting. Now, I should probably say at the start that the phrase Nordic aliens already carries a great deal of baggage. It sounds dramatic. It sounds specific. It sounds like the kind of thing someone should only say while standing in front of a corkboard full of red string and newspaper clippings. But the reason this idea has lasted is not just because it is strange. It has lasted because it is familiar in a very particular way. Of all the alleged beings reported in UFO lore, these are the ones that do not seem completely foreign. They are almost human. A little too human, perhaps. Human enough to make people wonder whether the story is not only about visitors from elsewhere, but about us, about what we think power looks like, what wisdom looks like, what salvation looks like, and what kind of face we find easiest to trust. That, by itself, is already interesting. After all, when people imagine beings from another world, why do so many stories swing between two extremes? On one side, you get creatures so bizarre they barely fit inside language, all tentacles, lights, impossible geometry, and deeply unhelpful anatomy. On the other side, you get beings who could walk into a room full of people and only stand out because they are just a little too polished, a little too symmetrical, a little too calm, as if ordinary human awkwardness had been edited out of them. If the universe is really full of life, should we expect our visitors to look like us at all? Or is the human-like form in these stories telling us something not about the stars, but about the people doing the seeing? Still, the stories persist, and that is where tonight's question begins to grow a little more interesting. Are Nordic aliens already among us? Not merely visiting in secret ships and disappearing into clouds at convenient moments, but here, walking unnoticed, blending in, guiding things quietly, perhaps even shaping human affairs from behind the curtain. It is the kind of idea that can sound absurd in daylight and surprisingly persuasive around midnight. That is often the way with these things. A theory does not survive for decades because it is proven. It survives because it does something to the imagination. It creates a pattern where before there was only randomness. It offers hidden order. It suggests that the world might not be as chaotic as it looks. And people have always had a weakness for that. One reason the Nordic alien story has been so durable is that it did not emerge all at once as a polished modern myth. It developed gradually through contact accounts, UFO reports, spiritual movements, occult traditions, science fiction imagery, and the long human habit of translating the unknown into the familiar. In many of these accounts, the beings are described in surprisingly consistent ways. They're tall, often blonde or fair, often blue-eyed, usually composed, sometimes dressed in simple, close-fitting garments that sound like futuristic uniforms, designed by someone with a fondness for practical elegance. They are said to speak calmly, sometimes telepathically, and often present themselves as concerned observers rather than conquerors. They warn, they advise, they suggest humanity is on the wrong path. They sound, in many stories, less like invaders and more like stern but patient exchange students from a better civilization. There is something almost funny about that. Imagine travelling across unimaginable distances, mastering the secrets of the cosmos, crossing light years or dimensions or whatever route is currently fashionable in speculative propulsion, only to arrive on Earth and immediately begin giving moral advice to a species that still argues online about whether a hot dog counts as a sandwich. Yet this pattern appears again and again. The Nordic figure in UFO lore is often not here to destroy us, not usually to abduct us for grotesque experiments, not even mainly to terrify. The role is different. These beings are often described as messengers, guardians, overseers, or participants in some long quiet relationship with humanity. That immediately makes them more unsettling in a subtle way. A monster outside your window is frightening. A watcher who has been here for a very long time is something else, and that may be why the idea of them already being among us has such pull. It answers a certain kind of human itch. We look at history, at strange leaps in culture, at sudden turns in technology, at recurring myths of shining visitors or wise strangers, and some people begin to ask whether humanity has always had company. Not obvious company. Not fleets hovering over capitals in broad daylight, though that would certainly simplify a few debates. Instead, hidden company. A presence just behind events. Quiet nudges rather than open rule. A hand on the tiller never seen directly, only guessed at when the ship turns. That idea is not unique to UFO culture, of course. Versions of it appear everywhere. Ancient gods descending from the sky, angels appearing in radiant form, mysterious teachers arriving from nowhere offering knowledge then departing, unknown kings, hidden masters, immortal guardians in the mountains, beings who look like us but are not quite us. Humans have long told stories about superior intelligences living nearby but just out of sight. Sometimes they come from heaven, sometimes from beneath the earth, sometimes from distant islands, inner worlds or neighbouring dimensions. Modern alien lore did not invent the hidden guide. It just gave the guide a spacecraft, a cleaner haircut, and a more interstellar resume. Of course, we should be careful here, because this is also where the story becomes tangled with some deeply awkward and uncomfortable ideas. The very term Nordic carries historical and racial associations that cannot simply be ignored. When beings are repeatedly described as tall, fair, beautiful, and superior, it raises obvious questions. Why this form? Why this appearance? Why do supposedly advanced beings so often resemble a very particular human ideal that has been culturally elevated in certain times and places? That does not automatically mean every witness invented the same figure for ideological reasons, but it does mean the symbolism matters. Myths do not grow in a vacuum. They absorb the hopes, anxieties, and biases of the cultures that produce them. If people imagine benevolent star visitors who look like idealized Northern Europeans, that tells us something. Possibly several things, none of them accidental, and yet, even once you notice that, the story does not simply disappear. In fact, it becomes more complicated because now there are at least two mysteries instead of one. First, are the beings real? Second, why do they appear in this specific form in reports and beliefs? If they are inventions, why this invention? If they are projections, why this pattern? If they are real, why would they choose such a form? Is it camouflage? Is it symbolic? Is it tailored to human expectations? Or are people describing an experience that their minds translate into the closest available image of authority? beauty and calm competence. In other words, when someone reports seeing a Nordic alien, are they describing what was there or what their mind was able to render? That question sits at the centre of many paranormal accounts, not just UFO reports. Human beings are not cameras. We are interpreters. We build reality out of sensation, expectation, memory, and emotion. That does not mean every strange encounter is false. It means every strange encounter arrives filtered. A bright light becomes a craft. A presence becomes a person. A voice in the mind becomes telepathy. A feeling of overwhelming peace becomes proof of benevolence. Anyone who has ever misread a coat rack in a dark room understands the principle, even if the coat rack rarely follows it up with a message about humanity's spiritual development. What is striking, though, is how many people who tell these stories insist that the emotional effect was as important as the appearance. Nordic beings are often said to radiate calm, certainty, or kindness. Witnesses describe them as deeply reassuring, though sometimes in a way that feels a bit too controlled, a bit too polished, almost rehearsed. That is worth noticing. A creature can be terrifying because it looks monstrous, but it can also be terrifying because it looks perfect, too graceful, too serene, too certain. Human beings tend to trust rough edges because rough edges feel honest. Absolute calm can start to feel like distance, and distance, even when politely dressed, can be unnerving. This is one reason the Among Us theory takes hold so easily. If such beings existed and wanted to move unnoticed through society, the logic goes, they would not choose forms that stand out. They would choose forms that inspire trust while remaining just uncommon enough to be memorable. Not average, slightly elevated. The sort of person strangers turn to look at without knowing exactly why. Beautiful, but not flamboyant. Composed, but not robotic. Distinctive, but not strange enough to trigger alarm. Whether or not one believes this, it is easy to see the narrative appeal. It offers a ready explanation for every unusually poised stranger, every charismatic figure, every person who seems just a bit detached from ordinary human messiness. We have all met someone who enters a room and makes everyone else seem slightly underassembled. In everyday life, we call that charisma. In UFO mythology, given the right lighting, it becomes evidence. And once a theory teaches people what to notice, they begin noticing it everywhere. That is how hidden world beliefs often function. They sharpen attention selectively. Suddenly patterns seem obvious. A politician with unusual presence, a celebrity with striking symmetry, a spiritual teacher with piercing eyes and a suspiciously patient smile. An old family story about a strange visitor. A photograph where someone looks just a little too unusual. Piece by piece, the theory feeds itself. Not because it is necessarily true, but because it becomes a lens. And once you start looking through a lens, the whole world tends to organise itself to match. This does not make such beliefs trivial, though. Far from it. The need to believe in hidden beings among us often emerges from a very human dissatisfaction with surface explanations. We are told history is messy, politics is chaotic, culture changes through countless small forces, and most events result from a grand collaboration between accident, ambition, fear, luck, and paperwork. That is probably true, but it is not especially satisfying. Hidden guidance theories offer something neater. They restore intention. They make the world feel authored. That can be comforting. Frightening too, but strangely comforting. Better a secret plan than no plan at all. Better hidden shepherds than total randomness. At least, that is how the emotional logic works. There is another layer to this as well, and it may be the most revealing one. The Nordic alien story often appears during periods when technology is advancing quickly, traditional beliefs are wobbling, and people feel suspended between old certainties and new confusion. In such times, the image of a wiser, more advanced humanoid presence becomes especially attractive. These beings are not merely extraterrestrials. They are an answer to modern disorientation. They embody what humanity wishes it could become, or fears it has failed to become. They have science without chaos, intelligence without cruelty, authority without visible corruption, and beauty without apparent effort. Conveniently enough, they also tend to agree with the storyteller's preferred warnings about war, materialism, or spiritual decline. One hesitates to call that suspicious, but one does raise an eyebrow, and yet, once again, the oddity remains. For all the obvious reasons to doubt, the accounts do not vanish. They continue because some witnesses speak with deep conviction. Some stories are elaborate, some are emotionally powerful, some come from people who do not sound as though they set out to become supporting characters in a very niche documentary. The modern world is full of hoaxes, misunderstandings, delusions, and creative embellishments, yes. But it is also full of experiences that people struggle to explain. Most of those experiences probably stay mundane under scrutiny. A few become stranger the more closely they are examined. Not many, but a few. And that tiny remainder is where legends build their homes. So when we ask whether Nordic aliens are already among us, we are not really asking a single question. We're asking several at once. Are there hidden intelligences interacting with humanity? Have people genuinely encountered humanoid entities that do not fit ordinary categories? Why do certain forms repeat across stories? Why do the alleged visitors seem less alien than expected? Why do so many accounts describe not simply observation but guidance? And why does the idea of silent, benevolent, beautiful watchers feel both comforting and deeply suspicious at the same time? Maybe it's because the thought plays on a very old tension. We want to be noticed by the cosmos. We also want to remain free. We like the idea that wiser beings might care about us. We do not especially like the idea that they may have been here the whole time, silently evaluating the species like patient school inspectors with an interest in nuclear policy. We want proof, but perhaps only the kind of proof that flatters us. A public landing on the White House lawn would be dramatic, certainly, but it would also end the day with our entire species feeling like it had just been caught pretending to understand things. The gentler version of the story is more manageable. They're already here, but discreet. Present, but not controlling. Concerned, but not intrusive. They appear only to certain individuals. They guide quietly. They hide for our sake, perhaps because we are not ready. That phrase, of course, has done excellent service in every belief system that cannot quite produce the goods. Humanity is not ready is a very elegant substitute for unfortunately there is no evidence. Still, it survives because it keeps the possibility alive. It allows mystery to remain mysterious while postponing the burden of proof to some future date that never seems to arrive. And that is where tonight's subject becomes more than a simple extraterrestrial question. It becomes a question about how belief works when certainty is unavailable, how stories form around longing, how the unknown gets dressed in recognizable features, how people build bridges between folklore, religion, modern sightings, and personal experience. Because before we can ask whether such beings are actually here, we have to ask what people have really said they saw, and why those reports took this very particular shape. Tall visitors, fair faces, calm voices, familiar strangers who feel less like monsters from another world and more like figures stepping out of some half-remembered human dream. And once those reports begin to gather, the story starts to take on a life of its own. When people talk about Nordic aliens, they usually speak as if everyone already knows what that means, which is impressive considering that the term refers to beings no one has ever managed to introduce at a press conference. Even so, the picture tends to arrive very quickly. They are said to be tall, not just average person tall, but noticeably tall, the kind of height that makes a doorway seem briefly more important than usual. They are usually described as physically attractive in a calm, almost unnerving way. Their features are often symmetrical, their posture upright, their expressions composed. Their hair in many reports is blonde or very light, sometimes white blonde, sometimes golden, sometimes simply described as fair. Their eyes are often blue, grey or light-coloured. Their skin is usually pale, clear, and oddly free of the little irregularities that make real human faces look lived in. No tiredness, no crookedness, no evidence that they have ever had to search the house for missing keys while running late. That is the basic image most people carry around, even if they have only heard the phrase in passing. But once you move past the quick sketch and start looking at what witnesses, believers, and UFO writers have actually claimed over the decades, the figure becomes a little more detailed and a little stranger. These were not usually described as wild-eyed creatures with sharp teeth, or monsters looming from the dark, or bizarre beings who seemed barely adapted to human reality. The reason they stand out in UFO lore is almost the opposite. They're too close, too familiar, too easy to imagine sitting across from you. If a grey alien is strange because it looks like a biological question mark, a Nordic alien is strange because it looks like someone who might already be in the room. That apparent closeness matters. It changes the whole emotional tone of the encounter. In reports involving greys, reptilians, insect-like beings, or other more obviously alien forms, witnesses often focus first on fear. The body reacts before the mind can interpret. Something is wrong. Something is non-human. Something is looking back that does not belong to the ordinary world. With Nordic-type entities, the reaction described is often more mixed. People speak of awe, calm, fascination, even reassurance. Some say the being seemed kind. Others say they felt watched but not threatened. A few describe them as so composed and gentle that the encounter seemed almost dreamlike. Yet that calm can also take on a sharp edge. A being that looks nearly human but slightly better in every possible way can be unsettling for reasons that are harder to define. The wrongness is not in its ugliness. It is in its precision. Descriptions of their clothing are also surprisingly consistent in a broad, fuzzy kind of way. The outfits are often close-fitting, plain, and light-coloured. Some witnesses describe robes, others mention one-piece suits, uniforms or garments that look futuristic without being theatrical. There are usually not many buttons, zippers, pockets, or practical little annoyances that earthly clothes seem unable to live without. The impression is often of smoothness, cleanliness, and design without clutter. If you have ever noticed that fictional advanced civilizations are always better at avoiding wrinkles than the rest of us, you are not alone. In some stories, the clothing glows faintly or reflects light in unusual ways. In others, it is simply white, silver, blue, or pale grey. Nothing too dramatic. Nothing that would embarrass them in front of the galactic neighbours, one assumes. Witnesses often describe their movement in the same polished terms. They do not fidget. They do not stumble. They do not seem rushed. Many do not seem to be in a hurry, not stumble. They do not seem rushed. Many accounts say they moved gracefully, almost too gracefully, with an ease that felt practiced beyond normal human habits. This is an important part of the image. The beings are not only human-looking, they are human-looking after all the little rough edges have been removed. Their bodies seem controlled. Their speech, when they speak aloud, tends to be measured and calm. Their emotions, at least as far as witnesses can tell, rarely erupt. Even when they are delivering warnings about humanity's future, they are reported as composed rather than panicked, which is probably wise. If you're going to tell a stranger their civilization is headed toward disaster, a soothing voice does help. That voice, interestingly, is not always said to be heard in the normal way. A large number of reports describe telepathy or some form of direct mental communication. Witnesses say they understood the being without seeing its mouth move, or that the words arrived in the mind rather than through the ears. Others say the lips moved, but the meaning seemed to bypass ordinary speech. This feature appears in many kinds of alien encounter stories, but with Nordics it takes on a particular role. Telepathy reinforces the idea that these are not brutes or invaders. They are higher, calmer, more refined. They do not shout. They do not bark commands. They impress meaning directly into awareness, as if ordinary speech were a ladder humanity still uses, while they have already found the elevator. Now, that is the romantic version. The less romantic version is that telepathy is extremely convenient in stories where witnesses later struggle to remember exact phrasing, precise language, or anything that might be independently checked. If a being spoke in your mind, then the message can remain powerful while also staying frustratingly hard to verify. That does not mean every witness invented it. It means the structure of the experience protects the mystery. And in this area of belief, mystery is like fertilizer. Everything grows well in it. Another very common feature in these accounts is the feeling of emotional control or influence. Witnesses sometimes say the beings projected calm into them. Others say fear vanished the moment the figures appeared, even though the situation should have been terrifying. Some describe a peaceful heaviness, a sense of trust, or the odd certainty that no harm would come to them. A few go further and claim the being seemed able to regulate the emotional atmosphere completely, almost as if the witnesses' reactions were being gently adjusted in real time. That is one reason not all reports paint these encounters as comforting. For some people, the very smoothness of the experience becomes suspicious later. They begin to wonder whether the peace they felt was their own, or whether it had been induced. A stranger making you feel safe is pleasant. A stranger deciding that you will feel safe is something else. And that brings us to one of the most important things the visitors people described were said to be not merely humanoid, but superior in a specifically moral and intellectual way. In contact law, Nordic entities are often presented as wiser, spiritually advanced, ethically evolved, and deeply concerned about humanity's trajectory. They warn about war, they warn about nuclear weapons, they warn about greed, environmental destruction, moral decline, spiritual emptiness, or the dangers of becoming too attached to material life. In other words, they often sound like a blend of philosopher, school counsellor, and disappointed cosmic uncle. This pattern appears so often that it becomes part of the type. The Nordic alien is not just a body shape, it is a role, a messenger, an observer, a corrective voice from outside the system. That role helps explain why so many people distinguish Nordics from other reported beings. Greys are often described as clinical, emotionally flat, technologically focused, and associated with abduction stories that involve medical procedures, missing time, and enormous discomfort, both physical and existential. Reptilian figures, in the darker branches of UFO belief, are often cast as manipulative, predatory, or overtly hostile. Nordic beings, by contrast, usually occupy the more benevolent end of the spectrum. They are the ones believers point to when they want the universe to contain wise neighbours, rather than only lab technicians with a poor bedside manner. Even when they are mysterious in a cleaner, quieter way. They unsettle by poise rather than by menace. Of course, once you start reading across decades of claims, the consistency is far from perfect. Some witnesses say these beings were clearly benevolent. Others describe coldness or distance beneath the calm exterior. Some say the Nordics warned humanity with genuine concern. Others say they seemed detached, almost like researchers presenting discouraging data. A few accounts even blur the line between benevolent and manipulative, suggesting that the beings were pleasant on the surface but controlling underneath. This is where the type becomes especially interesting, because it reminds you that the image is not just handsome and blonde and tall. It is also ambiguous. Too much perfection makes people suspicious. The same features that make the Nordic figure seem trustworthy can also make it seem staged. And yet, despite all those variations, the broad picture remains recognisable. The beings are described as elegant, calm, strikingly human, often beautiful, usually taller than average, and emotionally controlled. They may be male or female in appearance, though both are usually described as idealized versions of human attractiveness. Female-presenting beings are sometimes reported as having long blonde hair, very fine features, and a quiet but commanding presence. Male-presenting beings are often described as broad-shouldered, fair-haired, strong-looking, and unusually serene. What stands out in both cases is that the appearance is never random. It always seems selected, designed, almost curated. That is part of what makes the type hard to separate from human cultural ideals. The Nordic alien looks less like a wildly original extraterrestrial and more like a specific answer to the question, if a superior being wished to appear acceptable, even admirable to certain modern humans, what would it look like? That does not settle anything, but it does frame the puzzle. These beings are not only described as extraterrestrials, they are described as extraterrestrials through a very human lens of familiarity, beauty, and authority. It is one thing to say a witness or something beyond explanation. It is another to notice that the unexplained thing happened to be wearing features many cultures have historically coded as noble, clean, elevated, or trustworthy. There is another recurring element worth noticing. In many stories, the beings are not only beautiful and calm, they're healthy in a way that seems almost symbolic. They're free from visible disease, weakness, aging in the normal sense, or bodily awkwardness. Their age is often difficult to estimate. Witnesses may say they looked youthful but also ancient, mature but somehow untouched by wear. That combination appears again and again in myths of superior beings. Humans are used to intelligence arriving in older bodies and beauty arriving in younger ones. A being that seems to possess both at once carries immediate symbolic force. It feels complete. Too complete, perhaps, which is why such figures are so easy to mythologize. Height also matters more than people sometimes realize. A tall being is not merely larger, it changes the emotional geometry of the encounter. Height can signal status, authority, protection, intimidation, or nobility depending on context. In Nordic accounts, it often does several of these at once. The being is physically impressive but not monstrous, elevated but still proportionate. The witness can imagine standing next to it, but would likely feel diminished by comparison. That is exactly the sort of body a storyteller would invent for an advanced visitor who's meant to seem both accessible and superior. Again, maybe that means the reports are projections. Maybe it means real entities chose a familiar template. Maybe it means that whenever humans meet the unknown, they dress it in shapes their psychology can immediately rank. One detail that often slips by unnoticed is how frequently witnesses describe the beings as radiating certainty. Not simply intelligence, but certainty. They know where they are. They know why they came. They know what they are doing. They do not appear confused, defensive, or improvisational. This matters because uncertainty is one of the most human traits imaginable. We leak it everywhere, into our posture, our voices, our timing, our tiny hesitations. A being without visible uncertainty immediately feels unusual even before you process its face. That might be why reports so often emphasize eye contact. The Nordic figure meets the gaze steadily. There is no fluttering nervousness, no social scrambling, no sign that it wonders how it is being received. It behaves like something entirely at ease with itself. That composure also feeds one of the more dramatic claims attached to these visitors, which is that they may be able to pass among humans unnoticed. Not unnoticed in the sense of invisible, but unnoticed in the sense that most people would simply register them as striking or unusual, and then move on. If a being looked mostly human, dressed in a restrained way, moved with confidence and avoided drawing too much attention, could it blend in? In theory, yes. In practice, it depends how much faith one has in humanity's powers of observation, which, to be fair, are not always overwhelming. People fail to notice their own eyeglasses while wearing them. A disguised extraterrestrial might actually stand a chance. Still, most encounter accounts do not present the beings as permanent neighbours casually shopping for groceries. They appear in thresholds, in isolated roads, bedrooms, desert spaces near craft, in altered states, during moments of missing time, or in contact experiences that feel half physical and half mental. That is another key aspect of who these visitors were said to be. They were not ordinary presences entering ordinary life in a stable, public way. They were liminal figures, appearing at the edges of normal perception, that places them in a long tradition of beings who arrive when the world feels slightly thinned out. Fairies, angels, spirits, divine messengers, shining strangers, visitors in the wilderness. The modern alien framework changes the language, but not always the structure. Once you recognise that, the reports start to feel both modern and very old. The witness sees a beautiful figure unlike anyone they have known. The figure communicates knowledge, warning, or reassurance. It seems both human and beyond human. The experience feels real, but not entirely anchored in ordinary space and time. The witness is changed by it, convinced that the world contains presences most people never notice. That pattern could be slotted into a 20th century UFO book, a 19th century mystical memoir, or an ancient tale of divine visitation with surprisingly little rearrangement. Only the accessories change. One era gives the messenger wings, another gives it a glowing craft. All of this makes the question of identity especially slippery. Who were the visitors people described? In the simplest sense, they were tall, fair, human-looking alien beings associated with UFO contact stories, and often framed as benevolent or spiritually advanced. But in a deeper sense, they were also mirrors. They reflected hopes about guidance, fears about manipulation, cultural ideals about beauty and authority, and the modern desire to believe that somewhere out there, or perhaps already here, intelligence has matured beyond our usual chaos. That is why the image lasts. It is not just a monster catalogue entry. It is a psychologically efficient figure, familiar enough to trust, elevated enough to admire, distant enough to mystify. There is a temptation, when looking at a subject like this, to settle too quickly into one camp, either to laugh it off as fantasy assembled from science fiction, spiritual longing, and suspiciously selective aesthetics, or to accept it too eagerly as evidence that benevolent extraterrestrials have been politely monitoring us while waiting for the species to calm down. Both approaches are too easy. The real interest lies in the middle, in paying attention to what people actually said, to the repeated features, the emotional patterns, the symbolic shapes, and the fact that a very particular kind of being kept showing up in human reports. Whether those reports describe external reality, internal experience, or some difficult mixture of both is a larger question, and it will take us further. Because now that we have a clearer sense of what these visitors were said to be, the next thing that matters is the most obvious, and yet the most revealing detail of all: why they were described as looking so much like us, and not just like us in a general sense, but like an improved, polished, quietly idealized version of humanity that begins to say as much about the people doing the seeing as it does about the beings they claim to see. One of the strangest things about the Nordic alien idea is not that these beings were supposed to come from somewhere beyond Earth. It is that they were said to look so much like people already here, not approximately human in the way a child might draw an alien with 2 eyes, a nose and a smile just to keep things manageable. Not humanoid in the broad science fiction sense where something walks upright and has the correct number of elbows. These beings, according to many accounts, looked specifically, closely, uncomfortably human. Human enough that the witness often did not begin by thinking, "I am looking at an extraterrestrial." The first thought was often much simpler. Who is that person? Why do they look so unusual? Why do they seem so calm? Why does something about them feel just slightly off? That is where the real oddness begins, because in stories about visitors from other worlds, we expect difference. We expect forms shaped by unfamiliar conditions, alien biology, or the creative instincts of people who have looked at too many sea creatures and decided the universe probably took the hint. We expect big eyes, strange limbs, unusual proportions, odd skin, or at the very least some feature that says this entity did not evolve in the same neighbourhood as us. But with Nordic beings, the difference is reduced rather than exaggerated. The witnesses do not usually describe a body plan from another branch of life. They describe a person who seems unusually complete, taller, fairer, straighter, more composed, cleaner in design, if that is not too rude a way to discuss another species. And that raises the obvious question, why would a being from another world look so much like a human being? There are several possible answers, and all of them are interesting for different reasons. The first answer, of course, is the skeptical one. They looked human because the witnesses were human, and human minds interpret the unknown using familiar patterns. When people have experiences they cannot explain, especially experiences that are emotional, strange, half-seen, dreamlike, or overwhelming, the mind does not calmly wait for laboratory confirmation. It builds meaning fast. It grabs the nearest available shapes. A presence becomes a figure. A figure becomes a person. A person becomes the kind of person the witness's culture associates with beauty, authority, calm, wisdom, or power. If that is what happened, then the Nordic alien is not a real being in the external sense. It is a human translation of something less clear. That explanation deserves respect because it accounts for a great deal. Human beings are excellent at making the uncertain feel recognizable. We do it constantly. We see faces in clouds, intentions in accidents, and personalities in objects that are barely qualified to be coat hangers. In more intense situations, that interpretive habit becomes even stronger. If someone experiences a bright light, a strange state of consciousness, a compelling dream, sleep paralysis, a traumatic event, or a deeply unusual encounter of any kind, the mind may assemble the memory afterward using available symbols, and what symbols are available depends on culture, expectation, prior stories, personal ideals, and the emotional meaning of the moment. A 20th century American contactee might see a tall blonde space visitor. A medieval mystic might see a radiant angel. A much older witness might report a shining god or a noble spirit from the sky. The structure of the experience may remain similar even while the costume department updates with the times. That said, the skeptical explanation is not the only one believers offer. In UFO literature and contact lore, one common answer is that these beings look human because there is some genuine connection between them and us. Perhaps humanity was influenced, guided, seeded, engineered, or shaped by outside intelligences long ago. In that version of the story, the resemblance is not accidental at all. It is evidence of kinship. We look like them because they had a hand in what we became, or because we and they share ancestry deeper than mainstream history allows. This idea is dramatic, certainly, but it has obvious appeal. It turns similarity from a problem into a clue. The more human the beings appear, the more significant the encounter becomes. Not strangers, then, but relatives with better posture and much more advanced transportation. Another possibility, and one often suggested in more flexible versions of the myth, is that the beings only appear human. In other words, their human likeness is a presentation, not a biological fact. They may use telepathy, projection, mental influence, or some kind of perceptual shaping to appear in a form that feels acceptable to the witness. If they truly are alien in some deeper sense, perhaps they understand that dropping the full and honest version of themselves into the average human nervous system would be counterproductive. So they appear in a way that reduces fear, not too foreign, not too plain, familiar enough to allow communication, different enough to convey importance. That explanation has a certain elegance, at least narratively. It keeps the beings mysterious while also explaining why they seem suspiciously adapted to human psychology. They do not naturally look like that, perhaps. They simply know that humans are more likely to listen if the messenger does not resemble a nightmare assembled by a nervous octopus. There is also a more biological argument that some people have made, though it rests on a great many assumptions. If intelligent life evolves under similar physical constraints, perhaps humanoid bodies are not so improbable after all. Bilateral symmetry, upright movement, manipulative hands, forward-facing vision, and certain body ratios may be useful for tool-using, social, technologically capable beings. That idea appears now and then in science fiction and speculative discussion. Perhaps the human form, or something very close to it, is not a bizarre cosmic exception. Perhaps it is a practical solution that evolution arrives at under certain recurring conditions. Even if that were true, though, it would not explain why these beings were said to resemble not just humans in general, but a very particular idealized subset of humans. Evolution might give you upright tool users. It does not obviously explain the cheekbones, and that is where things become harder to ignore. The Nordic alien is not merely human-like, it is human-like in a way that reflects recognizable cultural preferences. Tallness, symmetry, light features, calm beauty, controlled expression, physical grace, clear skin, and a kind of elegant composure have all been associated in various modern contexts with nobility, superiority, or refinement. That means the image is never culturally neutral. Even if no one intends anything troubling, the visual language already carries meaning. The being does not simply look human. It looks like an idea of high-status humanity. That should make anyone pause. Why would reports from alleged encounters with non-human intelligences so often produce a figure that matches an already available human template of elevated attractiveness and authority? One possible answer is simple social psychology. When people imagine benevolent superiority, they often imagine it in a form they have been taught to admire. A calm, beautiful, fair-featured person with measured speech and commanding stillness is easier for many cultures to read as advanced than, say, a short, awkward, irritated being with terrible posture and a confusing haircut. If that sounds shallow, it is because human pattern recognition is frequently shallow on first contact. We infer quickly. We trust faces before evidence, confidence before proof, polish before depth. The Nordic figure may therefore tell us not what extraterrestrials look like, but what humans instinctively accept as the appearance of benevolent power. And yet the resemblance goes beyond beauty. Witnesses often emphasize that the beings looked healthy, balanced, proportionate, and free from the little noise of ordinary human life. No twitchiness, no social uncertainty, no obvious fatigue, no clumsy body language, nothing in the face or motion that suggests inner conflict, poor sleep, or having made a regrettable decision involving caffeine 6 hours too late in the day. This too matters. The beings seem human, but not burdened by the same visible friction. They look like humanity after the errors have been edited out. That is deeply important to the myth. They are not only visitors, they are improved people. The familiarity is what opens the door. The improvement is what gives them authority. That improvement can be comforting or unsettling depending on how one feels about perfection. Some witnesses describe the beings as immediately reassuring because they look so serene and composed. Others report the opposite. The very smoothness of their appearance and behaviour made them uneasy. They felt as if they were looking at a performance of humanity rather than humanity itself. This is a subtle but essential point. Something can look human and still trigger unease if it lacks the tiny irregularities by which we recognise one another. Real people leak information constantly. We hesitate, blink oddly, shift weight, misjudge distance, scratch our faces, interrupt ourselves, get distracted, say the wrong word, laugh at the wrong time. The Nordic figure in many reports appears strangely free of that noise. It presents no small failures. That can feel less like grace and more like absence. Modern psychology has a phrase that hovers nearby here, even if it does not map perfectly onto the situation. The uncanny valley usually refers to figures that are almost human but not quite, producing discomfort because the resemblance is close enough to engage social recognition, but off enough to disturb it. The Nordic alien concept lives on a strange edge of that territory. It is not grotesque. It is not obviously artificial. It may even be beautiful. But that beauty, combined with just a little too much symmetry, calm and emotional control, can create the same kind of tension. The witness recognizes a person and yet senses a gap. Something is missing. Something is too exact. It is not the horror of seeing a monster. It is the quieter discomfort of meeting someone who seems to have studied human presentation very carefully and mastered it just beyond the point of comfort. That impression helps explain why the beings are so often described as both attractive and unnerving. Those two reactions are not opposites. In many cases, they travel together. People are drawn to what seems elevated, confident, and composed. They are also wary of it when it becomes too polished to read. This is especially true when the encounter happens in already unusual circumstances. A bright room at night, a road in isolation, a moment of missing time, a dreamlike state, a setting where ordinary cues have broken down. In those moments, the mind pays intense attention to faces and bodies because it is trying to determine safety. A figure that looks human enough to matter, yet strange enough to resist categorization, becomes unforgettable very quickly. There is also a practical storytelling reason the beings looked so human. Human-shaped visitors are easier to talk about, easier to remember, easier to draw, easier to adapt into culture, and easier to attach moral meaning to. A witness can report not just what they saw, but what they felt the being intended. Facial expression, posture, eye contact, and body movement all feed interpretation. The more human the figure, the more easily the witness can assign purpose. This matters because many reports are not simply about sighting a strange body. They are about feeling addressed, observed, warned, chosen, or understood. A truly alien form might be spectacular, but it would be much harder to read as a teacher or guide. A very human-looking figure can carry not only presence, but message. And those messages, in Nordic accounts, tend to sound remarkably human as well. Warnings about war, environmental destruction, spiritual emptiness, the misuse of technology, the need for moral growth. The beings look human, they speak in human categories, and they often behave like idealized philosophers or guardians. That is either a sign of very accommodating extraterrestrials or very revealing storytelling. Perhaps both possibilities should remain on the table for the moment. The larger point is that their humanity is not limited to appearance. It extends into role, tone, and function. They seem built to be legible to us. Some believers take that as evidence that the visitors have been studying us for a very long time. If a non-human intelligence wanted to communicate effectively, it would make sense to choose a form and style that the witness could process without collapse. A giant mantis delivering telepathic advice about world peace might struggle with audience retention. A calm, human-looking figure with steady eyes and gentle authority would do much better. This is the camouflage argument again, but not camouflage in the sense of hiding in a crowd. More like psychological accommodation. Show the witness a face they can bear. Give them a body they can rank. Offer difference in manageable amounts. Enough to impress, not enough to overwhelm. Others go further and argue that the resemblance is strategic in an even more direct way. If these beings really are among us, then looking human is not just useful for contact events. It is essential for moving within society unnoticed. That theory appears often in the more conspiratorial branches of the topic. According to that line of thinking, a being that can pass as an unusually attractive, calm, tall human could operate in public with relative ease. People might notice something distinctive, but they would not jump immediately to extraterrestrial infiltration unless they were already having a very unusual afternoon. The theory feeds on the very plausibility of the appearance. A completely alien being would need concealment technology. A near-human being might only need sunglasses and a talent for avoiding small talk. Still, even that idea reveals something more human than alien at its core. We tend to imagine hidden power in forms that already dominate our social attention. The stranger who is too beautiful, too composed, too persuasive, too effortlessly commanding becomes a candidate for secret identity. The same thing happens in myths of angels, vampires, fey nobles, demigods, or hidden bloodlines. There is a long tradition of linking unusual beauty with unusual origin. The body becomes an argument. It says this person is not ordinary, and therefore must belong to a deeper story. Nordic aliens fit neatly into that old habit. They are less a break from folklore than a modern update of it. This is why comparisons with older beings keep surfacing. Angels in many traditions were not always described as abstract light or terrifying wheels of fire. They were often rendered in human form, but improved human form, radiant, beautiful, calm, commanding. Their appearance signalled both familiarity and otherness. The same is true of many divine messengers, fairy beings, hidden rulers, and celestial teachers in world mythology. They arrive looking enough like people to speak to people, but with some mark of elevation, height, brightness, beauty, stillness, voice, presence. The Nordic visitor slips into that old role with remarkable ease. Replace the ancient mountain or temple with a craft or a glowing room, and the structure of the encounter barely changes. That does not prove the experiences are identical, of course. It does suggest that the human mind may return to a limited set of forms when representing contact with the beyond, whether that beyond is interpreted as spiritual, mythic, psychological, or extraterrestrial. The noble human-like messenger may simply be one of our oldest containers for the unknown. It allows us to imagine intelligence greater than our own, without severing the possibility of relationship. A giant insect can study us. A cloud of sentient plasma can impress us. But a tall, calm, human-looking being can advise us. It can look at us in a way we understand. It can seem disappointed in our choices, which for some reason makes the whole thing feel even more official. There is one more possibility worth considering, and it sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. Perhaps the beings looked so human not because the witnesses invented them, and not because the beings truly resemble us, but because the encounter happened at a level where inner and outer experience cannot be cleanly separated. In that kind of event, the witness might perceive something real, but the mind would still participate in shaping how it appeared. The result would be neither pure hallucination nor simple observation. It would be an encounter filtered through the structures of expectation, symbolism, and emotion. The witness sees what is there, but sees it in a form the psyche can host. That idea is hard to test, which is exactly why subjects like this remain unsolved for decades. It explains too much and proves too little. Still, it has the advantage of honouring both the sincerity of witnesses and the obvious cultural patterning of the reports. At the very least, the human appearance of these beings is not a side detail. It is the centre of the whole mystery. If Nordic aliens were described as blue jellyfish with legal concerns, the mythology around them would be entirely different. It is precisely their resemblance to us that gives them their power. They are close enough to invite identification, and different enough to suggest improvement. They can be read as hidden relatives, disguised observers, projected ideals, ancient archetypes, manipulated perceptions, or genuine visitors using a face we will not immediately run from. Whatever explanation one prefers, the human likeness is doing the heavy lifting. So when people asked why these beings look so human, they were really asking several questions at once. Why did witnesses repeatedly describe a nearly human figure rather than something openly alien? Why did those figures embody such recognizable ideas of beauty, authority, and calm? Why did they feel familiar enough to trust, yet strange enough to remember for life? And why does the image continue to work even now, in an age that has seen more fictional aliens than probably any civilization should responsibly consume? The answer is not simple, but one thing is clear. The Nordic figure did not stay in memory because it was wildly different from us. It stayed because it stood so close to us that the difference, however small, felt charged with meaning. And once that happened, it became almost inevitable that people would start asking how such a being entered the modern imagination in the first place. and why the story spread so effectively once it did. The Nordic alien story did not arrive in popular imagination all at once, fully dressed, perfectly lit, and ready for a documentary thumbnail. It came together slowly, piece by piece, through contact stories, UFO reports, spiritual movements, science fiction imagery, Cold War anxiety, and the very old human habit of taking whatever frightens or fascinates us and giving it a face we can live with. That is one reason the images lasted so well. It was not built in a single moment. It was layered into culture over decades, until the figure of the tall, fair, calm visitor started to feel as if it had always been there, waiting quietly in the background of modern myth. To understand how that happened, it helps to remember that the early UFO era looked very different from the one most people imagine now. Today, when people hear the word alien, they often picture the grey type first. Large head, dark eyes, thin body, medical table, missing time, dreadful atmosphere, very poor customer experience from start to finish. But that was not always the dominant image. In the years after the Second World War, especially during the great flying saucer excitement of the late 1940s and 1950s, many stories about extraterrestrials sounded less like horror and more like strange spiritual visitation. The visitors in those accounts were often human-looking, sometimes beautiful, often wise, and very fond of offering serious advice about the future of humanity. This was the age of the contactee. That term matters because it marks a different mood. An abductee is taken. A contactee meets, receives, communicates, or is chosen. The emotional shape is not the same. In the contactee wave, the witness often described encounters with beings from other planets who looked much like humans, only more refined. They were not usually reported as grotesque or clinical. They were calm, radiant, intelligent, and deeply concerned about Earth, particularly about war, nuclear weapons, and the moral direction of the species. One begins to notice very quickly that this sounds less like a random biology report and more like a sermon that took the scenic route through outer space. That does not make the stories unimportant. In fact, it is what makes them culturally important. These early contact tales appeared at a moment when the world was technologically astonished and morally shaken. Humanity had split the atom, built devastating weapons, entered the jet age, and begun peering into space with a mix of pride and panic. Science was moving quickly. Traditional religious certainty was wobbling for many people, but it had not disappeared. Into that atmosphere came stories of advanced beings from the sky who looked like perfected humans and warned that Earth was in danger of destroying itself. The symbolism could hardly have been more efficient if it had been designed by committee. One of the most famous figures in this world was George Adamski, whose stories helped define the image of the friendly, human-looking space visitor in the public imagination. In his accounts, he met beautiful, peaceful beings from other planets, especially Venus, which at the time still had enough mystery attached to it to support an astonishing amount of hopeful nonsense. These visitors were often described as spiritually evolved, morally advanced, and alarmed by human aggression. They were not random creatures from a hostile void. They were civilized, concerned, almost disappointingly well-adjusted. They felt less like aliens in the modern cinematic sense and more like elder cousins who had come to inspect a family branch that had made several regrettable choices. This was not just one man's imagination operating in isolation. A whole contactee culture grew around similar claims. Other writers and speakers described tall, attractive space brothers, blonde or fair-haired extraterrestrials, radiant humanoids, and benevolent cosmic visitors who communicated telepathically and carried warnings about atomic danger. The details varied, as they always do, but the pattern became familiar enough that the type began to settle into public awareness. Human-looking visitors from the stars were no longer an odd one-off. They were becoming a recognized category within UFO belief. What is especially revealing is that these stories often borrowed as much from spiritual tradition as from science. The visitors had spacecraft, yes, but they also had an almost saintly quality in many accounts. They were calm, they were morally serious, they were often beautiful in a way that seemed designed to signal purity rather than biology. Their messages sounded less like alien field notes and more like cosmic guidance for a civilization that had become too materialistic, too violent, and too careless with its power. In other words, the contactee era did not simply modernize mythology by replacing angels with aliens, it blended the two. The beings arrived in ships, but they functioned a great deal like celestial messengers. That blend was one of the key reasons the image entered popular imagination so effectively. A completely unfamiliar creature is hard to attach to older cultural instincts. A beautiful human-like visitor, on the other hand, slips neatly into a role people already understand. It can be guardian, teacher, observer, warning bearer, or hidden guide. It can be spiritual without belonging to any single religion. It can be scientific without feeling cold. It can satisfy the modern appetite for space while still feeding older hungers for meaning, hierarchy, and reassurance. That is a powerful combination. The figure could live in magazines, lectures, paperback books, late-night radio, and private belief without seeming entirely absurd to those already prepared for mystery. Science fiction also helped, though not always in a direct way. Mid-century popular culture was full of imaginative speculation about life on other worlds, advanced civilizations, and superior humanoid beings. Film and pulp fiction often portrayed aliens in forms that were easier to stage, easier to costume, and easier for audiences to emotionally process. Humanoid beings were practical on screen and symbolically useful on the page. That did not create the Nordic figure all by itself, but it helped keep the idea of human-like extraterrestrials familiar rather than shocking. By the time UFO contact stories began circulating widely, the public imagination had already been softened up by decades of fictional visitors who looked suspiciously manageable. There was also a deeper current beneath all this, one that connected UFO belief to older esoteric traditions. Long before the flying saucer era, Western occult and spiritual movements had already developed rich ideas about hidden masters, higher beings, advanced races, and spiritually evolved entities guiding humanity from behind the curtain. Theosophy, certain New Age precursors, and related currents had popularized the idea that superior intelligences existed nearby, but concealed, whether in remote lands, subtle dimensions, or inaccessible realms of initiation. Once the language of space travel and extraterrestrials entered public imagination, it did not replace those older ideas so much as give them new clothing. The hidden master could now step out of a spacecraft instead of a mountain sanctuary. The teacher from a higher plane could arrive from another star system. The function remained strangely similar. This matters because modern myths rarely begin from nothing. They grow by attaching themselves to older structures people already find meaningful. The Nordic alien story succeeded because it plugged into several at once. It drew from religious imagery of radiant messengers. It drew from occult ideas of hidden guides and superior beings. It drew from science fiction expectations about advanced civilizations. It drew from post-war anxieties about human self-destruction. It drew from social ideals of beauty, order, and refinement. When all those threads came together, the result was a figure that felt new enough to belong to the space age and old enough to feel strangely familiar. As the decades continued, the UFO landscape began to shift. The contactee era lost some of its innocence. Reports of benevolent human-like visitors did not disappear, but darker stories became more prominent. Abduction accounts gained cultural force. Greys began to dominate the popular image of extraterrestrials. The mood changed from guidance to intrusion, from warning to violation, from moral concern to clinical strangeness. And yet the Nordic figure never vanished. Instead, it adapted. It remained in the mythology as a contrasting type, the elegant alternative to the grey. Where one image suggested cold experimentation, the other suggested wisdom, beauty, and hidden purpose. The mythology needed both. One gave fear a face, the other gave hope one. This contrast helped keep the Nordic story alive in popular imagination, even when it was no longer the headline act. In the more complex UFO belief systems that developed later, different alien types began to be arranged almost like a cosmic cast of characters. Greys became the unsettling technicians. Reptilians became the sinister manipulators in more conspiratorial traditions. Nordics took their place as the beautiful, often benevolent humanoids with a mysterious interest in human destiny. Once a mythology reaches that stage, it becomes harder to uproot, because it is no longer a single report or a single belief. It is a world. It has roles, factions, reputations, and recurring symbols. People entering the subject are not just hearing one claim. They're inheriting an entire ecosystem of narrative expectations. By the late 20th century, the Nordic type had also been strengthened by television, documentaries, paperback culture, conspiracy publishing, and the endless ability of fringe subjects to reorganize themselves into more elaborate systems. Contact stories were no longer just printed in obscure newsletters or told at small gatherings. They circulated more widely. The same images, descriptions, and assumptions repeated across media, which gave them a kind of false solidity. Repetition can do that. A thing said often enough begins to feel less like a strange claim and more like an established category. Even people who did not believe in Nordic aliens outright started to recognize the image. That is when a story crosses into modern myth. It no longer depends on proof, it depends on recognizability. The internet naturally accelerated everything. Once online forums, image boards, video platforms, digital archives, and later social media took hold, every corner of UFO lore became easier to circulate, remix, exaggerate, and preserve. The Nordic alien image benefited especially well from this. It was visually simple, emotionally flexible, and easy to connect to larger theories. It could be folded into ideas about hidden bloodlines, ancient astronauts, spiritual awakening, government secrecy, starseeds, secret alliances, genetic programs, and almost any other framework that needed a face both exotic and reassuring. A giant insect being is hard to market as your hidden celestial cousin. A tall blonde figure with calm eyes is much more adaptable. This is also where the line between report and archetype grew thinner. Once an image becomes culturally familiar, later witnesses may describe experiences through it, whether or not their original perceptions were that clear. Someone has a strange dream, a sleep paralysis event, a sighting, a contact experience, an altered state vision, or a memory that does not fit ordinary life. They reach for language. The culture hands them available forms. Nordic alien becomes one of those forms. That does not mean every later report is copied. It means that modern myth provides templates for experience, and those templates shape memory. The more recognizable the type becomes, the more easily it enters new stories. That process can be frustrating for anyone hoping for clean evidence, but it is fascinating for anyone interested in how myths work. A myth survives not because it stays pure, but because it remains useful. The Nordic alien remained useful because it could mean many things at once. For some, it represented literal extraterrestrials. For others, interdimensional beings. For others, spiritual guides described in modern terms. For others, psychological projections carrying messages the mind could not deliver directly in ordinary language. For still others, it was simply a vivid and durable piece of UFO folklore. The ambiguity helped, rather than hurt. A figure that can be read in several ways has a much better chance of lasting than one tied too tightly to a single fragile claim. Another reason the image entered popular imagination so successfully is that it carried aspiration. The grey alien frightened people. The Nordic alien invited identification. Even those who never believed literally could feel the pull of the idea. A being that looks like us, but calmer, wiser, healthier, more beautiful, more spiritually mature and less trapped in our usual panic, has obvious symbolic appeal. It is the alien version of humanity's better self, or at least one of the more flattering drafts. This gave the myth unusual staying power, because it did not just threaten the audience, it tempted the audience. It suggested that beyond our present condition there might exist a refined version of personhood watching, waiting, perhaps even guiding. That temptation became especially strong once New Age thought absorbed the image more fully. In those settings, the Nordic figure was often no longer merely an extraterrestrial visitor arriving in a craft. It became a sign of cosmic kinship, a marker of higher vibrational identity, or evidence that some humans were spiritually linked to star origin beings. At that point, the mythology had moved from encounter narrative into identity narrative, which is always a major step. A story about something outside you can remain interesting for a while. A story that tells you who you are, where you came from, or what hidden role you might play becomes far harder to shake loose. The Nordic alien was now not just a visitor in some accounts, but an ancestor, teacher, or origin point. Modern myth loves nothing more than becoming personal. Popular imagination also tends to preserve what is visually efficient. The Nordic figure is efficient, tall, fair, beautiful, human, but more so. A child could sketch the idea, a filmmaker could cast it, a novelist could describe it in one sentence. A conspiracy theorist could assign it to hidden political influence. A spiritual teacher could link it to ascension. A UFO witness could use it to organize a difficult memory. A bored internet user could turn it into an image thread by lunchtime. Simplicity helps myths travel. The image did not need elaborate explanation to survive. It was portable. At the same time, the image carried enough tension to remain interesting. If the beings had been purely angelic, they might have drifted too far into harmless inspiration. If they had been purely monstrous, they would have become just another fear symbol. What made the Nordic figure durable was the balance. It was attractive, but not entirely safe. Familiar, but not ordinary. Benevolent, but slightly too composed. The mythology left room for admiration and suspicion at the same time. Some believers saw protectors, others saw manipulators wearing a pleasant face, still others saw a deeply human fantasy of noble outsiders. The figure could support all three readings without breaking. By the time modern audiences inherited the full story, the Nordic alien had already passed through enough cultural layers to feel bigger than any original report. It lived in books, UFO lectures, old contactee tales, fringe documentaries, online speculation, conspiracy frameworks, spiritual communities, and the shared visual vocabulary of extraterrestrial lore. That is what modern myth looks like. It is not one source, it is accumulation. It is what happens when scattered stories become a recognizable figure, and that figure becomes a kind of mental furniture people know how to place, even if they disagree about what it means. So the Nordic alien story entered popular imagination by doing something very few strange ideas manage. It bridged worlds. It let science fiction touch religion without admitting it was doing so. It let spiritual longing borrow the language of space travel. It let Cold War fear wear the face of cosmic guidance. It let older myths of radiant visitors continue under modern conditions. It gave UFO culture a figure who could instruct rather than only terrify. And once the image settled in, it became easier and easier for later stories to build on it, especially those that cast these beings not simply as visitors from elsewhere, but as calm messengers whose gentle appearance concealed a deeper uncertainty about what, exactly, they wanted from us. What made the Nordic alien figure different was not simply the way these beings were said to look. It was the mood they carried with them. In a landscape full of frightening sightings, missing time stories, medical table nightmares, and creatures that sounded as if they had been designed specifically to make sleep more difficult, the Nordic type arrived with a very different atmosphere. These were not usually described as snarling invaders or cold experimenters. They were calm. They were composed. They were often presented as peaceful, even kind. If other alleged visitors from beyond Earth seemed to belong to the category of things one hoped never to meet in a hallway, the Nordic beings were framed more like strange dignitaries, as though the universe had decided to send humanity a delegation of very serious, very elegant people who would like a quiet word about our recent behaviour. That gentle image is one of the main reasons the type stayed so memorable. Without it, the Nordic alien might have been just another unusual entry in the long catalogue of UFO lore. Tall, blonde, human-looking beings would still have stood out certainly, but what gave them narrative power was the sense that they came not with open hostility, but with warning, concern, patience, and a strange kind of disappointed affection. Again and again in contact stories, they were described not as conquerors, but as observers who had seen enough of humanity to form opinions. Unfortunately for us, those opinions often seemed to include the idea that we were bright but reckless, ambitious but spiritually underdeveloped, and making far too much progress in the direction of self-destruction. It is almost funny when put that way. Across the great distances of space, or dimensions, or consciousness, or wherever exactly these beings were supposed to be operating from, they arrived only to discover that humanity still could not be trusted around sharp objects or ideological certainty. Yet that was very often the tone. The messages associated with Nordic figures tended to focus on peace, restraint, moral development, spiritual growth, and the danger of war, especially nuclear war. This was no small detail. It was central to the type. A Nordic being was rarely just there. It usually had something to say, and what it said usually sounded less like a scientific briefing and more like a warning, delivered by a patient teacher who had watched the class fool around with dangerous equipment for long enough. This immediately separated them from darker alien archetypes. The grey, in modern folklore, became associated with abduction, invasive procedures, emotionless observation, and a kind of sterile detachment that people found deeply upsetting. Reptilian figures, in the more dramatic and conspiratorial corners of the mythology, were often treated as openly hostile or manipulative, creatures of control, dominance, hidden power, and unpleasant intent. Nordic beings, by contrast, seemed to occupy the role of the reassuring visitor. Even when their presence was strange, their style was not usually brutal. Even when they seemed powerful, they were said to exercise that power gently. If one alien type made people feel like laboratory material, the Nordic type made people feel like a troubled civilization receiving advice it had not quite earned. That contrast matters because modern myths work best when their figures have distinct roles. People do not just want mysteries, they want categories. They want to know which beings mean danger, which ones mean wisdom, which ones might offer help, and which ones might turn up in a documentary narrated in a tone that strongly suggests nobody in authority is taking responsibility. The Nordic figure settled into the role of the benevolent, or at least the apparently benevolent outsider. This created a balance within UFO culture. The cosmos was not only cold and predatory, it also contained intelligence that looked at humanity with concern rather than contempt. That made the whole system more emotionally complete. Fear alone can build a mythology, but hope helps it last. Still, the gentle image also created its own problems, and those problems are part of what made the figure so enduring. Because once you describe a being as beautiful, calm, wise, and deeply peaceful, you naturally invite a follow-up question. Peaceful according to whom? Kind in what sense? Concerned for whose benefit? A messenger of peace sounds comforting until one notices that many such messages involve telling humanity what it should stop doing, how it ought to evolve, what path it must avoid, and what higher order it has failed to understand. None of that is automatically sinister, of course. Plenty of good advice has been delivered in history. But the moment a superior being begins instructing us for our own good, a small alarm bell starts ringing somewhere in the background. That is why the Nordic image has always carried a subtle ambiguity beneath its polished surface. The beings were framed as benevolent, yes, but not always transparent. They were said to know more than they explained. They appeared and disappeared on their own terms. They chose whom to contact. They often communicated through telepathy or altered states, which made the encounters powerful but difficult to verify. They brought warnings, but rarely evidence in the simple ordinary sense. They asked for trust while remaining beyond scrutiny. That combination is fascinating. It creates a figure that is not overtly threatening, but is never entirely safe either. The danger, if there is one, is not in claws or weapons. It is in asymmetry. They know. We do not. They choose the terms. We receive the message. That can feel protective, or it can feel like a beautifully packaged version of control. And that may be why the image endured so well. A purely benevolent figure can become dull. A purely monstrous one can become predictable. The Nordic alien sits in a more interesting place. It looks reassuring, speaks in moral language, and carries itself like a guardian, but it also remains opaque. Witnesses may feel peaceful in its presence, yet later wonder whether that peace was natural or imposed. They may believe they received a message of compassion, yet also feel subtly judged, managed, or guided toward conclusions they did not arrive at on their own. There is a difference between being protected and being handled, and the Nordic myth often hovers right on that line. That line becomes clearer when you look at the emotional atmosphere reported in many encounters. Witnesses frequently describe overwhelming calm, a sudden disappearance of fear, or a sense that the being radiated peace so strongly that resistance became difficult. At first glance, that sounds comforting. A terrifying unknown appears, and instead of panic, the witness feels serene. How convenient. But after the event, some people begin to question the experience. Was the calm a sign of goodness or a sign of influence? If a being can affect your emotional state directly, then its kindness becomes harder to measure. A person who makes you feel safe through warmth and honesty earns trust. A being that can simply switch fear off like a light is operating on a very different level. This is one reason the Nordic figure can be read in two opposite ways depending on the observer. To one person, the gentleness proves benevolence. To another, the gentleness is exactly what makes the figure suspicious. Human beings are used to obvious threats. We know what to do, at least emotionally, with shouting, violence, ugliness, aggression, or brute dominance. But calm superiority wrapped in beauty is much more difficult to evaluate. It can attract admiration while disabling skepticism. It can feel moral without being accountable. It can seem loving without revealing its motives. In everyday life, charisma already has this effect. Add the possibility of non-human intelligence, telepathic influence, and a flawless face, and the problem becomes much more dramatic. The peaceful image also worked because it allowed the Nordic being to absorb roles once filled by older religious or mythic figures. A fierce alien is hard to connect to the traditions of angelic visitation, hidden teachers, radiant messengers, or divine intermediaries. A beautiful, calm, human-looking being who arrives with warning and guidance fits much more neatly. This does not mean the two are identical, only that the emotional logic overlaps. The witness encounters a presence greater than ordinary humanity. It appears in a form that feels elevated rather than monstrous. It communicates moral urgency. It seems to know the state of the world better than the witness does. It departs without settling the matter in a way historians would find helpful. That structure is older than flying saucers. The modern alien frame simply rerouted it through the language of planets, crafts, and cosmic evolution. Because of that, the Nordic figure often carried a kind of secular holiness. Not holiness in the formal religious sense, but in the sense of a being that seemed cleaner, calmer, more ordered, and morally higher than ordinary life. Witnesses sometimes describe them almost reverently, not just attractive, but luminous, not just intelligent, but elevated. Not just peaceful, but embodiments of a more advanced state of existence. That is important, because it shows how the gentle image was doing more than softening fear. It was creating authority. Peacefulness alone does not make a being significant. Peacefulness combined with beauty, composure, certainty, and a message about humanity's moral failures creates something much stronger. It creates a figure people are prepared to listen to. And people often want to listen to figures like that, especially in times of uncertainty. When the world feels chaotic, the idea of a calm intelligence stepping in with perspective is deeply appealing. Humanity is noisy, divided, impulsive, and usually very confident at the exact moment it should perhaps consider sitting quietly for a while. In that context, a being that appears serene, centered, and above the turmoil seems almost medicinal. The Nordic alien becomes a fantasy of order. Not necessarily political order, though conspiracy versions sometimes go in that direction, but existential order. Someone knows what is happening. Someone sees the bigger picture. Someone has not lost the map. That is a seductive image, especially in periods when institutions, ideologies, and ordinary leaders feel less and less trustworthy. But comfort can hide dependency, and mythology often understands this even when believers do not say it directly. A figure that always arrives with higher wisdom may slowly train people to distrust their own judgment. A messenger of peace may also become a shortcut around uncertainty. Instead of wrestling with difficult moral and political problems ourselves, we imagine advanced outsiders who already know the correct answer. That is why some interpretations of the Nordic myth begin to tilt into suspicion. What if the gentle image is not just benevolence, but branding? What if peace is the mask that makes authority easiest to accept? What if calmness is not proof of goodness, but simply a very effective social tool? Humans, after all, are remarkably willing to follow confidence when it is well dressed. This is where the phrase masks of mystery begins to matter. The Nordic beings in these stories did not usually appear as open books. They appeared as curated presences. Their beauty seemed intentional. Their demeanour seemed intentional. Their messages, too, often felt shaped for effect. They rarely arrived rambling, uncertain, or full of practical detail that could be checked the next day in a notebook. They arrived with the sort of communication that deepens belief while preserving ambiguity. Warning without full explanation. Reassurance without transparency. Significance without ordinary proof. That is the perfect structure for a mythic messenger. It allows the witness to feel chosen, transformed, and informed, while keeping the figure itself just beyond reach. And still, many people who reported such encounters were sincere in their conviction that these beings meant no harm. That sincerity matters. It is easy to mock stories of cosmic peace messages, especially when they begin to sound as if interstellar civilization has spent enormous resources developing a program mainly devoted to telling Earth not to be so violent. But for many witnesses, the encounter felt real, intimate, and morally powerful. The being's gentleness was not a decorative detail. It was the core of the experience. Some felt seen rather than studied. Some felt comforted rather than examined. Some came away believing they had been in the presence of something wiser and kinder than ordinary humanity. Even if one remains skeptical, it is important to understand that the emotional force of the myth did not come from spectacle alone. It came from the claim that intelligence beyond Earth might not be indifferent to us after all. That possibility transformed the emotional texture of alien belief. A hostile universe is easy enough to imagine. Space is large, cold, and not generally organized around our sense of reassurance. But the idea that advanced beings might care whether humanity survives, matures, or destroys itself creates a very different cosmos. It makes the universe feel inhabited in a morally relevant way. We are not just one species among many. We are a watched species, a judged species perhaps, a developing species. That is both comforting and unnerving. Comforting because it implies we matter. Unnerving because being watched is not always a pleasant arrangement, especially when the watchers have better technology and excellent posture. There is also the matter of selective gentleness. In many accounts, the Nordic beings are peaceful, but not necessarily soft. They can be stern, they can be grave, they can be emotionally restrained in a way that keeps them from feeling fully warm. Their messages may be compassionate, but they are often delivered with certainty rather than intimacy. This adds another shade to the image. They are not kindly in the cosy, familiar sense. They are kindly in the way a physician might be kind while informing you that something must change immediately. There is care, but there is also distance. The witness is not embraced into equality. The witness is addressed from above. That posture reinforces the idea that these beings are not simply friends. They are evaluators, guides, or guardians whose peace comes from standing beyond the confusion rather than sharing it. And that distinction matters when people begin asking whether the peaceful image itself might be strategic. If a civilization wanted to influence another without triggering resistance, presenting as wise and non-threatening would be an excellent beginning. Again, this does not prove deception. It simply keeps the question open. A calm face can hide good intentions or manipulative ones. Human history is full of gentle rhetoric, attached to very mixed motives. The Nordic myth, perhaps without meaning to, captures that uncomfortable truth. It gives us beings who look and sound like peace, yet remain impossible to read completely. They are all signal and very little access. What made them different then was not just that they seemed kinder than other alien types. It was that their kindness came wrapped in superiority, beauty, and distance. They did not frighten by obvious threat. They unsettled through refinement. They did not arrive as monsters to be survived, but as presences to be interpreted. Their gentleness invited trust, but their mystery prevented closure. That combination made them far more flexible in popular imagination than a simpler figure would have been. People could believe in them as guardians, doubt them as manipulators, reinterpret them as spiritual archetypes, or dismiss them as projections of human longing. The image could support all those readings at once because it was built on ambiguity from the beginning. That ambiguity is probably the real reason the Nordic alien stood apart. It offered the possibility of benevolent contact without removing the tension that keeps a mystery alive. If the beings had been openly saintly, the mythology might have drifted into harmless fantasy. If they had been obviously menacing, they would have merged with countless other frightening visitors. Instead, they occupied the narrow and fertile ground between attraction and uncertainty. They looked like peace. They spoke like concern. They felt like order. But they never quite stopped being strangers, and the stranger who arrives smiling can sometimes be harder to understand than the one who arrives with all the usual warnings attached. So the gentle image did more than make these beings likable. It made them narratively dangerous in a quieter, more durable way. It raised the possibility that the most effective mystery is not the one that terrifies you into rejection, but the one that calms you into listening. That is what set the Nordic figure apart in the great gallery of extraterrestrial lore. These were not just beings from elsewhere. They were beings who seemed to know exactly how to appear in a way that would lower resistance, open attention, and leave witnesses with the unsettling sense that peace itself might sometimes be part of the enigma, which becomes even more interesting once the stories shift from general images and impressions into the specific claims people made about actual encounters in the night. Most stories about Nordic aliens become more intense the moment they move from general description into personal contact. It is one thing to talk about a type of being in the abstract, to describe tall figures, fair hair, calm faces, and messages about peace, as if we were sorting through a filing cabinet of modern myth. It is another thing entirely to ask what people actually said happened, when those beings supposedly appeared. That is where the subject becomes more intimate and more difficult, because encounter stories do not usually arrive as neat theories. They arrive as moments. A person wakes in the night. A strange light is present. Someone is standing at the edge of the room. A driver sees a figure on an isolated road where no one should be. A witness remembers an impossible face and a sense of overwhelming calm. Sometimes there is a craft nearby. Sometimes there is only a presence, a voice in the mind, a feeling that the ordinary world is thinned for a few minutes and something has stepped through. Night matters in these stories. It nearly always matters. Encounters in daylight do exist in UFO lore, of course, but the night encounter carries a different weight. Darkness changes the mind. It sharpens certain fears, softens details, and makes the boundary between waking and dream less secure than most people like to admit. A figure seen at noon can be questioned with the practical confidence of daylight. A figure seen at 2 a.m. while the house is silent and the air feels wrong enters memory differently. Even if the witness tries to remain rational, the setting does half the work for the story. Night makes everything more personal. The experience is no longer public world business. It is inside the vulnerable hours when ordinary life is least prepared to defend itself. Many of the reports that include Nordic-type beings follow a pattern that is strangely consistent without ever becoming fully identical. A person wakes abruptly and finds that the room feels occupied. There may be light where no light should be. There may be a humming sound, or silence so complete that it seems unnatural. The witness notices a figure, or several figures, standing near the bed, by the doorway, or just beyond the threshold of easy movement. In some cases, the beings are described as beautiful and almost reassuring. In others, they are more severe, more distant. Their calm somehow harder to trust. Very often, the witness says the fear they should have felt was reduced, dulled, or replaced by an odd peace. Then there is communication. Sometimes spoken, sometimes telepathic, sometimes more like direct understanding than language. The message may be a warning, a reassurance, a statement about the witness's importance, or a broad comment about humanity's path. Then the event ends, often with missing time, partial memory, or a lingering sense that something real happened just outside the reach of proof. If you look at that structure plainly, several explanations immediately compete with one another. One explanation is that these are encounters with actual non-human intelligences. Another is that they are experiences built from sleep paralysis, dream states, suggestion, stress, or memory distortion. Another is that the experience may begin with something unusual, but become shaped by the witness's mind into a more organized narrative afterward. And then there is the possibility, which always hovers nearby in these stories, that the distinction between outer event and inner experience is not as clean as people would like. Whatever one believes, the reports themselves are worth noticing because of how often they combine physical detail with altered consciousness. That combination is not a flaw in the myth. It is one of its defining features. The bedroom encounter is perhaps the best-known setting because it is also the most unnerving. The home is supposed to be the controlled space, the defended space, the place where one's own body can go off duty for a few hours. When extraordinary encounters happen there, the violation feels immediate even if the beings themselves are not described as aggressive. Nordic reports in such settings often differ from more frightening abduction accounts in one crucial respect. The beings do not always behave like operators conducting a procedure. They behave more like visitors who have already decided that being there requires no permission. That calm entitlement can be more disturbing than open force. A violent intruder makes sense within ordinary fear. A serene intruder who seems certain that the witness will cooperate belongs to a stranger category altogether. Some witnesses describe being invited rather than taken. That wording matters. They say they felt guided to rise, or found themselves moving without panic, or suddenly standing somewhere else without remembering the transition clearly. In the more benevolent versions of the story, the Nordic beings seem to escort, reassure, or simply communicate. The witness is shown something, told something, or made to feel that the event has a purpose. In darker variations, that same guidance feels more like control. The person remembers agreeing without understanding why, or remaining calm in a way that later feels unnatural, or sensing that choice had somehow been present in theory, but absent in practice. Again, the ambiguity is the point. These are stories where the line between invitation and command can become very thin. Roadside encounters make up another important class of report. Someone is driving late at night, often alone, often on a road that already feels too empty. There is a light in the sky, or a glow near the road, or a figure where no figure should be. The person stops, either out of confusion or because they feel compelled to. Then comes the sighting itself. A tall man-like or woman-like figure, strikingly attractive, pale or fair, strangely composed, sometimes standing near a craft, sometimes alone, sometimes appearing as if waiting. The witness later struggles to explain why they felt more wonder than fear, or why the being seemed immediately different from any ordinary person, despite looking broadly human. The atmosphere in these stories is almost always slowed down, as if time itself became heavy. Details stand out sharply while sequence becomes blurred. The person remembers the face, the eyes, the stillness, but not always how long the encounter lasted or exactly how it ended. That odd compression of memory is one reason such accounts are so hard to sort. Real shocking events can distort time. Sleep events distort time. Dream states distort time. Trauma distorts time. So does astonishment. When witnesses later describe an encounter as lasting 10 minutes and 40 minutes at once, or as feeling both immediate and stretched, they may be telling the truth about their experience even if the event itself remains unclear. This is part of why encounter stories survive skepticism more easily than people sometimes expect. The witness is often not lying in any simple sense. They are reporting a lived event as honestly as they can. The problem lies not in sincerity, but in interpretation. Some of the most influential contact stories involving Nordic-type beings include communication that sounds less like personal conversation and more like message delivery. The witness is told that humanity is at a dangerous turning point. Nuclear weapons appear frequently in these accounts, especially in stories that took shape during the Cold War and after. Environmental collapse becomes more prominent in later versions. Sometimes the beings warn that human violence harms more than Earth alone, as though the cosmos itself objects to our talent for escalation. Sometimes the message is more spiritual. Humanity has forgotten its true nature. Materialism is blinding us. Consciousness must evolve. A few reports become very personal, telling the witness they have a role to play, a memory to recover, or a connection to these beings that predates the encounter. That is where the stories begin to move from event into identity, and once that happens, they become even harder to untangle. One reason these reports claimed contact had already happened is that they often included a feeling of familiarity. This is one of the strangest recurring elements. The witness does not always feel they are meeting complete strangers. Instead, they say the being seemed known somehow, as though this were a continuation rather than a first meeting. The face may be new, but the emotional tone feels remembered. That impression appears across many forms of extraordinary experience, and it is powerful because it bypasses ordinary skepticism. If something feels ancient, intimate, or previously known, the mind gives it a special kind of authority. Unfortunately, dreams, altered states, religious visions and traumatic memory can all generate that same effect. So once again the encounter sits in an uncomfortable middle space, where psychological explanation and paranormal interpretation borrow one another's strongest features. It is also worth noticing that not all reports place the beings in bedrooms or on roads. Some describe meetings aboard craft or in spaces that do not behave like ordinary rooms. The witness finds themselves in an environment that is brightly lit but shadowless, clean but strangely featureless, technological but almost too elegant to feel mechanical. Then the beings appear. Their clothing may be simple, pale, seamless. Their faces are striking but reserved. In some stories, there are other beings present as well, sometimes greys, which creates an interesting hierarchy within the mythology. The Nordic figures are then interpreted as supervisors, diplomats, or higher-ranking intelligences, while the greys are treated as technicians or assistants. Whether this says anything about actual extraterrestrial organization is another matter. What it certainly says is that human storytelling likes structure. Even in the unknown we assign roles. This mixed-cast version of the Contact story is especially revealing because it shows how the Nordic figure functions in relation to other alien types. If greys are cold and procedural, the Nordic being becomes the one who explains, softens, or oversees. If the setting is frightening, the Nordic presence often stabilizes it. Witnesses say things like, "One of them seemed kind," or "The tall blonde one reassured me," or "The human-looking figure was the only one I could bear to look at." That pattern may reflect literary shaping after the fact, but it also shows how strongly the image of the Nordic as mediator has taken hold. Even when surrounded by stranger presences, this being occupies the role of interpretable intelligence. The details witnesses remember are often remarkably ordinary in one sense and completely strange in another. They remember hair colour, height, the feeling of light fabric, the way the being stood without shifting weight, the impression that the eyes were unusually clear, the sense that the face was beautiful but almost too balanced, too still. They remember not being able to judge age properly. The being seemed youthful and ageless at once. These are not the details people usually invent when trying to impress others with something exotic. They are the sorts of details that haunt a memory because they are close to normal, but not quite normal enough. That is part of why the stories are effective. They do not describe impossible anatomy. They describe almost ordinary perfection, and that can feel far more vivid than spectacle. Then there are the stories that move beyond a single event and become recurring contact claims. A person says the beings returned over years. They appeared in dreams that felt more solid than dreams. They spoke during moments of waking stillness. They came during childhood, and again in adulthood. They watched from the edge of memory until some later event made the pattern visible. At this stage, the witness often begins to reinterpret their whole life. Certain fears, intuitions, obsessions, or moments of strange luck become pieces of a longer relationship. This is the point at which ordinary skepticism tends to grow impatient, but psychologically it is also the point at which the story gains maximum strength. Once a person no longer sees an encounter as isolated, but as part of an ongoing connection, the belief becomes harder to dislodge because it reorganizes the meaning of everything around it. Some reports also involve physical traces, though these are rarely decisive. A person wakes with marks, soreness, disturbed bedding, unexplained time loss, or the sense that something in the room has changed. A driver returns home far later than expected. Watches stop. Electronics behave oddly. Lights are seen by others. Now, none of that proves Nordic alien contact, obviously. Human life is full of odd timings, body marks, bad sleep, and technology that waits patiently until the least appropriate moment to become uncooperative. But within the structure of the encounter, these details become anchors. They let the witness say this was not only a dream, not only a feeling, not only imagination. Something happened in the physical world too. Whether that conclusion is correct is another question, but the need for that anchor is easy to understand. The witnesses themselves are often as varied as one would expect from a subject like this. Some are clearly immersed in UFO culture already. Some sound spiritual, mystical, or eager for cosmic meaning. Others present themselves as reluctant experiencers, embarrassed by the whole thing. the sort of people who insist they never cared about aliens before that night and would much prefer to return to a life where midnight did not involve telepathic visitors with unnervingly good bone structure. That variation is important because it prevents easy dismissal while never quite resolving the issue. If every witness fit a single profile, the subject would become simpler. Instead, it stretches across personalities, which keeps the door open just enough for the myth to keep breathing. And yet, skepticism remains not only reasonable, but necessary here. Encounters in the night occur in the exact territory where human perception is least reliable. Sleep paralysis can produce figures, pressure, presence, fear, or calm, all with astonishing realism. Lucid dreams can feel more coherent than waking memory. Hypnagogic states, trauma, medication, expectation, suggestion, and retrospective reconstruction can all produce very convincing experiences. Once a person begins reading contact literature, their inner imagery may become more organized around recognizable forms. None of this means every witness is wrong, but it does mean that the night is crowded with explanations before extraterrestrials even enter the room. If the reports still attract attention after that, it is because some of them feel too structured, too emotionally charged, or too personally transformative to shrug off as mere confusion. What keeps these stories alive, perhaps more than anything else, is the combination of intimacy and uncertainty. A person says this happened to me, not to humanity in the abstract. I saw the face, I heard the message, I felt the calm, I lost the time, I woke different. That kind of testimony can be doubted, but it is hard to flatten. The encounter becomes part of someone's biography. It may ruin their sense of normal reality, or deepen their spirituality, or fill them with fear, or make them quietly convinced that Earth is not as alone as it appears. Even when listeners remain unconvinced, they often sense that the witness is describing a real disturbance of some kind. And once that much is granted, the mystery survives. The event may not prove aliens, but it refuses to become nothing. This is also where the phrase already made contact becomes more complicated than it first sounds. Contact in these reports does not mean a public announcement, a landing on a government lawn, or a neat diplomatic exchange. It means contact in fragments, contact with individuals, contact under strange conditions, contact that leaves memory but not certainty, significance but not agreement, stories but not closure. If Nordic beings are part of the mythology, they are not remembered as conquerors arriving openly. They are remembered as night visitors, private communicators, figures who appear just beyond the edge of ordinary confirmation and then recede again, leaving behind testimony that can always be read two ways, and that may be exactly why the idea has lasted. A clean event can be disproved. A blurred event can live for decades. A witness says a tall, fair being stood by the bed and spoke without speaking. Another says a beautiful stranger appeared beside a croft on a lonely road. Another remembers a room of light and a calm presence that seemed more human than human. Another says the encounter has been happening since childhood, though memory only catches pieces. Taken separately, each account is fragile. Together they create an atmosphere, and atmosphere is often stronger than evidence in the making of modern myth. So the reports that claimed contact had already happened did not usually claim it in the form people say they want. No press release, no unambiguous artifact, no public demonstration that would satisfy every skeptic and make historians revise several shelves at once. Instead, there were nights, rooms, roads, silences, missing minutes, beautiful faces, and the persistent suggestion that some encounters feel less like first meetings than reminders. Whether those reminders point to real hidden visitors or to the way human consciousness stages the unknown is the argument that keeps going, and it becomes even stranger once people stop talking only about brief encounters and start asking the more unsettling question of what it would mean if such beings were not merely visiting individuals in secret, but walking through ordinary society without being recognized for what they are. The idea that Nordic aliens might walk among us unseen takes the story out of the bedroom, off the lonely road, and into ordinary life, which is exactly why it becomes so compelling for some people. A night encounter is dramatic, but it remains separate from the daily world. It happens in a sealed moment. It can be placed in a private box marked strange and carried around for years without changing how one looks at the cashier, the neighbour, the person at the airport gate, or the sharply dressed stranger who seems too calm in a crowd. The hidden in plain sight theory changes that. It says the visitors are not only appearing in exceptional moments. They're here all the time, blending into human society, moving through public spaces, influencing events quietly, and escaping notice precisely because they look so close to us that most people would never think to question what they're seeing. That is a much bigger claim, of course, and it appeals to a very specific kind of imagination. It takes the mystery from the edge of life and places it at the centre. Suddenly the subject is no longer about unusual contact events happening to a small number of people. It becomes about the structure of the world itself. If these beings are among us, then public life is not fully public. History is not fully human. Power is not entirely where it appears to be. There are observers in the room, perhaps participants, perhaps guides, perhaps something more difficult to define. Once that possibility enters the mind, it can attach itself to almost anything. That is one reason the theory has lasted so well. It is endlessly adaptable. Every unexplained success, every person with an unusual presence, every institution that seems strangely insulated, every historical turn that feels too precise can be pulled into its orbit. The first reason some people believe Nordic beings could walk among us unnoticed is simple. Of all the reported alien types, these are the ones supposedly best equipped for the job. A giant insectoid would struggle in a supermarket. A grey with an oversized head and black eyes would have a difficult time getting through public transport without causing questions and probably several phone calls. A reptilian, if one accepts that mythology at all, would require a level of disguise that starts to sound like an expensive special effects problem. But a tall, fair, strikingly human figure with calm manners and unusual poise could, at least in theory, move through society with comparative ease. People might notice the person was memorable. They would not necessarily conclude the person was not human. Most would simply assume they had seen someone attractive, charismatic or slightly unusual, and then continue with the business of trying to remember why they entered the kitchen. This is where the logic of the hidden in plain sight idea becomes surprisingly ordinary. It depends not on invisibility but on expectation. People generally see what they already know how to see. If a being fits within the outer boundaries of normal human appearance, then most observers will stop there. That is how social perception works. We categorize fast. Human, male, female, tall, well-dressed, unusual accent, very confident, and then we move on. Few people scan strangers for signs of extraterrestrial origin, and probably for good reason. A society in which that became routine would not be restful. So if a near-human intelligence wanted to pass among us, the theory goes, it would not need to fool everyone in a dramatic way. It would only need to remain inside the range of what people already accept as possible. Human attention does the rest. Believers often point to this as the very reason the Nordic figure is so persistent. It is not only a contact image, it is a plausible infiltrator image. The beings are said to be attractive, poised, articulate, and socially controlled, exactly the qualities that allow some people to move through institutions with ease. If such beings existed, why would they remain in forests or hidden bases all the time? Why would they not appear in cities, governments, corporations, research circles, spiritual communities, cultural leadership, or any place where human behaviour is organised and directed? Once the theory takes that step, it becomes less about sightings and more about placement. Not whether they can be here, but where they would choose to be if they were. That question immediately reveals a second reason people believe the story. Human beings already have a long history of suspecting that hidden elites exist behind visible systems. Sometimes that suspicion is justified. There are private networks, secret decisions, closed rooms, influence that does not appear on paper, power that travels quietly through institutions without introducing itself to the general public. That is just ordinary history. The hidden in plain sight alien theory piggybacks on that familiar truth and extends it into a much stranger direction. If unseen influence already exists in human affairs, then it becomes easier for some minds to imagine that the unseen influence is not entirely human. The step is large, but emotionally it does not feel as large as it should, because the groundwork of hidden power is already there. This is why theories about Nordic aliens among us often cluster around places of prestige, visibility, and command. Believers do not usually say these beings are all working night shifts at garden centres and quietly advising customers on compost ratios. They imagine them in roles that fit the symbolism of the type: diplomats, public figures, advisors, cultural tastemakers, researchers, spiritual leaders. People with unusual charisma, unusual symmetry, unusual calm, or an odd ability to remain untouched by the normal clumsiness of public life. The being does not need to look radically different. It only needs to feel slightly too polished, slightly too self-contained, slightly too comfortable in systems that make ordinary humans fray at the edges. Of course, it should be said that this logic is dangerous precisely because it can attach itself to almost anyone impressive. Once you teach yourself to interpret composure as otherworldliness, every poised person becomes suspect, every graceful public figure becomes a candidate, every unusually attractive stranger becomes a possible clue. That is one of the weaknesses of the theory, but also one of its strengths as a living myth. It never runs out of material. The world is full of people who seem more elegant, more controlled, or more charismatic than average. Most of them are simply people, but the theory does not need most. It only needs the possibility that one or two are not, and from there the imagination does what it has always done best. It begins arranging coincidence into pattern. There is also a psychological comfort in the thought that superior beings may be present in society, quietly steering things away from disaster. Not everyone imagines hidden Nordics as infiltrators in a sinister sense. Some imagine them as guardians, watchers, moderators, a stabilizing intelligence embedded within human chaos. This version of the belief tends to emerge when people feel that public life is becoming too irrational, too reckless, or too self-destructive. If humanity seems incapable of governing itself wisely, the fantasy of hidden wise beings nearby becomes more attractive. Not because it solves anything in a practical sense, but because it restores the possibility that someone somewhere knows what they are doing. History may look messy on the surface, but perhaps beneath it runs a calmer current directed by minds less impulsive than ours. That hope is one side of the theory. The other side is much darker. Some people believe the beings are among us not to help, but to shape human life for purposes we do not understand. In that version, the calm appearance of the Nordic being is not reassuring. It is strategic. A pleasant face is a form of access. A beautiful exterior lowers defences. A composed manner earns trust. If these beings really do influence institutions or individuals, then their human-like appearance would not be an incidental detail. It would be the perfect interface. They would not need to rule openly. They would only need to guide, suggest, cultivate alliances, or nudge culture in desired directions. That kind of influence is much harder to detect than conquest, and in some ways much more unsettling because it leaves human choice looking intact even when it may not be. This suspicion often grows from the same ambiguity that has followed the Nordic image from the beginning. They are gentle, but perhaps too gentle, wise, but perhaps too certain, beautiful, but almost too perfectly aligned with human ideas of beauty, supportive, but on their own terms. If one takes those features and tilts them slightly away from benevolence, the being becomes less like a guardian and more like a skilled operator. It still speaks softly. It still looks reassuring. It still radiates calm. But now the calm is read as management rather than kindness. The presence is not comforting. It is expertly calibrated. Some believers take exactly that view and argue that anything able to pass so easily among humans while withholding its true nature is, by definition, not entirely trustworthy. Again, whether one accepts any of this literally is another matter. The important point is that the hidden in plain sight theory thrives because it fits several powerful human instincts at once. We are drawn to the idea of secret knowledge. We suspect unseen influence. We notice unusual people and wonder what explains their effect on others. We prefer meaningful patterns to randomness. We like the thought that extraordinary appearances may hide extraordinary origins. And perhaps most of all, we are never fully comfortable with the idea that all visible power is exactly what it seems. The Nordic myth enters that restless territory and offers a neat answer. No, not everything is as it appears. Some of the most human-looking people in the room may not be human at all. There is also a cultural reason this belief gained traction. Modern life puts strangers in front of us constantly, but only in fragments. We see faces online, in passing, in curated images, in performance spaces, in brief public interactions. We get impressions without context. This creates an ideal environment for projection. A public figure can seem unnaturally composed because we see only the polished surface. A stranger can seem almost supernatural because we encounter them for 15 seconds under odd lighting in a hotel lobby and never again. A person can become a myth simply because their image is flattened into symbol. In that environment, the idea that certain people are not what they seem is almost inevitable. Modern society is a machine for generating partial perceptions, and partial perception loves hidden identities. Some versions of the theory lean on bloodlines and ancestry. Rather than imagining full extraterrestrial individuals moving around in disguise, these versions suggest that human families, lineages, or select individuals carry non-human heritage. The result is not a complete alien standing in society, but a hybrid presence, someone outwardly human yet carrying traits, memories, or capacities linked to another origin. This idea solves one of the obvious problems with the theory. Instead of asking how a fully non-human being could pass indefinitely in human systems, it imagines a spectrum. Certain people seem unusually calm, unusually striking, unusually intuitive, unusually detached from ordinary emotional noise because they are not entirely of one world. It is a dramatic claim, but it appeals because it turns visible difference into inherited significance. At that point, the theory begins to overlap with much older ideas: noble bloodlines, hidden descent from gods, chosen families, secret ancestry. The notion that some people are not simply people, but carry within them a more elevated or more dangerous strain of origin, is ancient. Mythology has returned to it again and again. Kings linked to the heavens, heroes fathered by divine beings, families with a special destiny or burden. The modern Nordic version is just the space-age edition. The language changes, but the emotional structure remains very familiar. People want to believe that the visible surface of humanity conceals deeper layers of identity, and that some individuals stand closer to those layers than others. Another reason some people believe these beings walk among us is that encounter stories sometimes feel too social to remain confined to isolated paranormal events. Witnesses do not only describe seeing strange beings near craft or during altered states. They sometimes describe meeting people in ordinary settings who felt wrong in a quieter way. A stranger with an intense but calm stare. Someone who seemed to know too much. Someone whose appearance was striking without being theatrical. A person who moved through a public space with no social static at all, as though the world simply adjusted around them. Most likely these experiences are just the mind noticing unusual confidence or unusual beauty and building a story around it. But when placed inside an existing mythology, they become evidence. The person was not just memorable, they were one of them. This is how myths colonize everyday perception. Once the narrative exists, life starts supplying examples. They are not random examples either. They are the ones that fit. The tall woman with the unreadable expression. The blonde man who seemed strangely emotionless and kind at the same time. The speaker whose voice made the room go still. The public figure who never seemed tired, rattled or genuinely exposed. One begins noticing a type. And once you notice a type, you can convince yourself it has always been there. Perhaps it has, in the most ordinary human sense. Certain kinds of presence do repeat. The mythology's power lies in persuading people that the repetition must mean more than personality. It is important, though, to see the cost of this style of thinking. A theory that explains too much can explain nothing well. If every charismatic person is potentially alien, the idea becomes impossible to test. If every composed stranger might be a hidden Nordic, then the theory stops generating knowledge and begins generating suspicion. That is often the point where folklore becomes paranoia. The boundary matters. A living mythology can enrich the imagination, sharpen attention, and raise interesting questions about symbolism, power, and human perception. But when it starts encouraging people to sort ordinary life into secret species categories, it turns unhealthy very quickly. The hidden in plain sight idea is compelling precisely because it sits close to that boundary. It can be told as wonder or told as obsession. Still, even from a skeptical perspective, the appeal of the theory tells us something useful. It reveals what people feel is missing from ordinary explanations. If someone believes superior beings are among us, quietly guiding history, it may reflect dissatisfaction with the messiness of real human systems. Accidents feel too accidental. Leadership feels too poor. Cultural change feels too unstable. The hidden Nordic offers coherence. Someone competent is embedded in the chaos. Someone wiser is in the room. Maybe the world is not just a sequence of blunders, panics, and competing appetites after all. Maybe there is design. Even a secret design can feel more comforting than none. On the other hand, if someone believes hidden Nordics are among us manipulating events, then the same dissatisfaction takes a different form. The world feels too artificial, too managed, too full of polished figures who seem insulated from ordinary human weakness. Something about power feels staged. Something about public life feels curated. The alien explanation steps in to intensify that suspicion. Perhaps those who seem least human in their detachment are in fact least human in a literal sense. It is not a rational leap in evidential terms, but it is an emotionally understandable one. The theory gives symbolic form to the feeling that visible life is not the whole story. This is why the hidden Nordic belief remains more durable than it may deserve to be. It does not depend only on UFO reports. It depends on social perception, dissatisfaction, symbolic reading, and the ancient habit of turning unusual people into signs of a hidden order. It works whether the listener is hopeful or afraid. It can support a vision of benevolent guardianship or covert control. It can explain charisma, secrecy, beauty, emotional distance, and the odd experience of meeting someone who seems to glide through the world with far less friction than everyone else. It even benefits from the fact that there is no obvious way to disprove it without discrediting all intuition, all unusual impressions, and all testimony at once. A theory that can absorb both proof and absence of proof is difficult to kill, and yet the most interesting part may not be whether these beings really walk among us. It may be why so many people find the thought believable in the first place. Why does a calm, attractive, superior-seeming stranger so easily become a candidate for hidden otherness? Why do we so readily imagine that unusual poise must come from unusual origin? Why does influence feel easier to understand if it comes from above or beyond rather than from the very human mix of money, discipline, confidence, performance, and luck? Somewhere inside this theory there is a confession about what people think humanity is missing and what kind of figure they think could supply it. because once the possibility of a hidden presence takes hold, it is only a short step before the story becomes even larger. If such beings can move among individuals unnoticed, then perhaps they do not merely observe ordinary life. Perhaps they shape important lines of descent, circles of influence, and the long movement of civilization itself, which is where the idea begins to merge with older claims about bloodlines, guidance, and the possibility that these visitors have not only walked beside us, but quietly steered us for far longer than anyone can prove. Once the idea takes hold that Nordic beings might move among us unnoticed, the next step usually arrives almost by itself. If they can be here, and if they can look enough like us to pass through society without immediate alarm, then perhaps they are not just watching individuals in isolated moments. Perhaps they are doing something more systematic. Perhaps they are not simply appearing in bedrooms, on lonely roads, or in half-remembered contact events. Perhaps they are attached to lines of influence, to families, to positions of power, to the long movement of history itself. That is where the theory becomes much larger, and also much older in spirit, because the moment people begin talking about bloodlines, hidden guidance, and the shaping of civilization by superior outsiders, they are no longer only in UFO lore. They are in the deep territory of human myth. This theory appears in several forms, some softer and some much darker. In the softer version, Nordic beings have helped humanity from behind the scenes. They are guardians of a sort, though not in the simple sense of stepping in every time things go wrong. They nudge rather than rule. They protect certain lines of knowledge. They quietly guide certain individuals or families who then go on to influence science, politics, culture, religion, or social direction. The beings do not control human history outright, because that would make our whole species feel a bit like a school project with too much outside help. Instead, they assist selectively. They encourage the better tendencies. They try to keep catastrophe from becoming final catastrophe. Humanity remains responsible for itself, but not entirely alone. In the darker version, the same structure becomes far less comforting. Now the bloodline is not a line of stewardship, but a line of access. Influence is not gentle correction, but hidden management. The beings are not patient guides, but quiet participants in systems of control, shaping dynasties, political circles, financial networks, and leadership classes over long stretches of time. The reason history feels manipulated, according to this view, is that it is. Not always openly, not always through direct intervention, but through cultivation. Certain people are selected, certain families are preserved, certain traits are encouraged, certain institutions become convenient channels. The beings remain mostly out of sight while their preferred patterns repeat through generations. This is the version that turns unease into conspiracy, and makes every impressive family tree start to look like a file someone forgot to properly bury. Both versions, for all their differences, share the same core idea. Human history is not entirely human in authorship. Something superior, hidden, and more patient than we are has its hand on the wheel. That idea is powerful because it solves several emotional problems at once. It explains why certain families seem to retain influence for absurd lengths of time. It explains why charismatic leaders or strange visionaries appear suddenly and seem to pull events around them. It explains why some people feel as if history contains surges of intelligence or symbolic timing that do not match the ordinary clumsiness of public life. Most of all, it explains continuity. Bloodline theories always explain continuity. They offer a reason why power, style, temperament, or destiny seem to pass down in lines rather than scatter randomly across the population. Of course, ordinary history already gives us many reasons for that. Wealth persists, education persists, access persists. Family networks persist. Social class has a remarkable talent for pretending it is merit after just enough generations. If a dynasty remains powerful, there are very human explanations available before anyone needs to start looking for telepathic visitors with superior cheekbones. But the hidden guidance theory does not thrive because history lacks explanations. It thrives because ordinary explanations often feel disappointingly plain. Money, inheritance, connections, and careful institutional positioning are real, but they are not especially mystical. They do not satisfy the deeper hunger for pattern and intention. A hidden bloodline tied to advanced beings from elsewhere does. That hunger is ancient. Long before anyone spoke about extraterrestrials, people imagined that rulers, heroes, or special families came from more than ordinary stock. Kings were descended from gods. Noble houses claimed sacred ancestors. Founders of civilizations were said to have been fathered by divine beings, chosen by heavenly powers, or marked from birth by signs that separated them from the crowd. The modern theory that Nordic-type entities shape humanity through bloodlines is, in many ways, a technological update to one of the oldest stories on Earth. Instead of a god descending in radiant form, now it is a star being. Instead of divine seed, now it is alien genetics. Instead of a royal house favoured by heaven, now it is a lineage linked to non-human intelligence. The language changes, but the emotional structure remains remarkably familiar. That familiar structure is worth slowing down for, because it shows why the theory feels believable to some people, even when evidence remains elusive. Humans are already used to thinking about special lines of descent. We speak about political families, old money, elite networks, dynastic business influence, social inheritance, genetic talent, legacy institutions, and families that seem to produce public figures generation after generation. Add a mythology of hidden Nordic beings to that existing framework, and suddenly ordinary dynastic continuity acquires a second layer. Maybe that family is not merely well connected. Maybe it has been cultivated. Maybe certain bloodlines are not just socially preserved, but intentionally maintained because they carry qualities these beings value. Intelligence, composure, beauty, emotional restraint, leadership, receptivity, or some more mysterious trait that makes contact easier across generations. The bloodline idea can also shift from literal family descent to something more symbolic. In some versions, it is not that Nordic beings physically interbred with humans in the straightforward sense. It is that certain human lines are repeatedly guided, contacted, or influenced across time. The family becomes special not because it contains visible alien DNA in the way conspiracy writers sometimes dramatize, but because it sits under ongoing attention. One generation has a contact experience, another generation has vivid dreams, unusual intuition, or a strange obsession with the stars. A later descendant enters a position of cultural influence, feels watched all their life, or reports encounters that seem to continue something older. This version of the theory is less biological and more relational. The bloodline matters because it forms a corridor, not because it proves species mixing in a laboratory sense. That distinction matters because it reveals how much of this subject is really about inheritance of meaning. People like to believe that destiny can move through families. A repeated name, a repeated talent, a repeated pattern of visions, unusual luck, recurring fascination with hidden knowledge, or a lineage full of strikingly similar personalities begins to feel charged. In ordinary life, we call this family resemblance, environment, expectation, psychology, education, or coincidence. In a secret guidance framework, it becomes evidence of attention from outside. The family is not merely repeating itself, it is being worked on. Once that thought appears, history becomes very tempting to reinterpret. Great founders, unusual reformers, charismatic rulers, strange advisors, seers, inventors, mystics, and unexplained public figures can all be reread through the theory. Believers begin asking whether certain people who seem too poised, too visionary, or too oddly placed were being guided by non-human intelligence all along. Why did this person rise so suddenly? Why did that dynasty hold such influence? Why do certain myths describe rulers as descended from the sky? Why do some families carry persistent stories of luminous ancestors, unknown visitors, or hidden protectors? None of these questions prove anything on their own, but together they create the feeling that ordinary history may be only the surface layer of a much older relationship. This is one reason the theory often attracts people who are dissatisfied with mainstream history, not only because of facts, but because of tone. Standard history can sound messy. It is full of accidents, compromises, disease, geography, money, ego, weather, timing, and the endless ability of human beings to improvise their way into disaster. That is probably accurate, but not always satisfying. Secret guidance theories restore narrative shape. They suggest that behind the noise there is order. Not necessarily good order, but order. The rise and fall of civilizations becomes more than human fumbling. It becomes part of a long-managed process, perhaps an educational program, perhaps an experiment, perhaps a stewardship effort, perhaps something nobody in the theory ever fully agrees on. Now, one has to admit there is a strong temptation in this. Imagine how much more elegant the story of humanity becomes if our most confusing turns are not merely the result of clashing empires, poor planning, and deeply unfortunate succession disputes. Imagine being able to look at cultural leaps, scientific breakthroughs, and sudden shifts in religious imagination and say, there, that is where they intervened. It gives history an almost literary neatness. Unfortunately, real history has never shown much respect for literary neatness. Still, the human desire for pattern remains, and this theory offers it in abundance. The Nordic version of the bloodline idea has its own particular flavour, because these beings are imagined not as monstrous infiltrators, but as refined presences with long-term purpose. They are calm enough to wait generations, disciplined enough to think in centuries, detached enough not to need constant visibility. That makes them ideal candidates for historical influence in mythic terms. A more openly aggressive alien type does not fit as well. You cannot easily imagine a civilization being quietly shaped over centuries by beings who look as though they would frighten the court horses. Nordic beings, by contrast, slide neatly into older models of hidden advisors, secret lovers of queens, stranger counsellors at royal courts, radiant teachers, and beautiful outsiders whose presence alters the course of kingdoms. Even when the theory becomes explicitly modern and conspiratorial, it still relies on these old shapes. The claims may involve governments, intelligence networks, elite circles, or global systems, but the emotional logic remains the same. Certain figures are thought to be more than they appear. Certain families are said to carry a hidden continuity. Certain circles of power are assumed to contain individuals whose cold composure or unusual physical presence hints at other origins. The story becomes a way of reading elite distance. Public figures often seem detached from ordinary life, and people resent that. The alien bloodline theory takes that resentment and translates it into literal non-humanity. They are not just out of touch, the theory whispers. They are not entirely us. That is a dangerous move, because it can quickly turn symbolic dissatisfaction into paranoid sorting. Once someone begins reading public life through hidden species categories, it becomes difficult to stop. Every polished face, every inherited fortune, every family with improbable reach can look like confirmation. The theory gains strength not through evidence, but through its ability to absorb all forms of visible hierarchy. That is how many conspiratorial frameworks survive. They borrow enough truth from ordinary life to make the larger leap feel emotionally justified. Dynastic power exists, secrecy exists, influence exists. Therefore, perhaps alien-guided bloodlines exist too. The logic is weak as proof, but strong as atmosphere. There is also a more spiritual version of secret guidance that avoids some of the harsher conspiratorial machinery. In this form, The beings do not shape history by controlling elites. They shape it by sending impulses into human consciousness. They inspire certain individuals at key moments. A mystic receives a vision. A philosopher has a breakthrough. A reformer develops courage that seems disproportionate to circumstance. An artist produces symbols that seem older than memory. A scientist follows an intuition that arrives almost fully formed. In this interpretation, the Nordic beings are not breeding dynasties so much as gardening consciousness. They choose receptive minds, perhaps within certain lineages, perhaps across the human population more widely, and encourage developments that push civilization along particular paths. This version has its own appeal because it turns guidance into influence without stripping humanity of agency entirely. People still create, decide, and act. They are simply not the only source of their deepest impulses. History remains human but porous. Ideas may have visitors in them. That is a difficult thing to test, obviously, which is one reason people who like it can enjoy it for a very long time without interruption from conclusive evidence. It also overlaps neatly with older traditions about muses, divine inspiration, heavenly instruction, and wisdom descending from beyond the visible world. Again, the modern and the ancient fit together with suspicious ease. Sometimes the theory becomes even more personal. A person begins to believe that their own family has been part of this hidden contact pattern for generations. A grandparent spoke of unusual lights. A parent had recurring dreams of tall beings. The person themselves feels watched, guided, or oddly separate from others. Family traits begin to look less like personality and more like markers. The tall stature, the light eyes, the strange emotional reserve, the persistent sense of not quite belonging, the fascination with stars, the feeling that the world is familiar but never fully home. All of these become clues within the belief system. Whether they are clues to anything outside the family imagination is another matter, but as a narrative structure it is extremely strong. It turns ordinary inheritance into cosmic inheritance. At that point, the theory becomes self-reinforcing. Once a family story exists, later experiences begin to fit themselves to it. Children grow up with hints of mystery. Certain dreams are remembered more vividly. Coincidences are given special status. A strange meeting, a compelling stranger, an unusual aptitude, even a persistent sense of being different can all be folded into the lineage. This is not unique to alien belief, of course. Religious families, artistic families, political families, and families full of old legends all do something similar. The difference here is that the source of the inheritance is imagined not merely as unusual, but non-human and ancient. Still, it would be too easy to dismiss the whole thing simply by calling it fantasy, because even fantasy can tell the truth about what people feel. The bloodline and secret guidance theory reveals a deep human discomfort with randomness, with unequal power, and with the visible persistence of influence across generations. It asks why some lines continue while others disappear. It asks why authority often feels hereditary, even in societies that pretend it is earned. It asks why certain people seem born into symbolic roles before they do anything to justify them. The alien explanation may be unsupported, but the questions it borrows are real ones. That is partly why the theory remains attractive. It offers a dramatic answer to genuine unease. It also reveals a familiar desire to locate higher order outside ourselves. If humanity is being guided, then history may still have purpose even when events look senseless. If bloodlines matter because they carry hidden contact, then social hierarchy becomes intelligible rather than merely unfair. If certain people are marked by otherworldly influence, then their strange impact on others is no longer baffling. Everything gains a place. That is the promise of the theory. Not proof, but arrangement. Not certainty, but a pattern strong enough to make the world feel authored again. The difficulty, of course, is that once history becomes too neatly authored, It stops looking much like history and starts looking like a story we told because it was easier to bear. Real civilizations rise and fall through human weakness as much as hidden design. Dynasties persist because people build systems to preserve them. Influence travels through schools, marriages, money, ideology, and social habit, with no extraterrestrial assistance required. Yet even knowing that, people remain drawn to the more secret version. The idea that wise or manipulative beings stand behind the curtain gives emotional shape to things that otherwise feel disappointingly human. And perhaps that is why this theory so often begins to merge with older stories the longer one follows it. Hidden bloodlines, radiant visitors, heavenly ancestry, beautiful teachers, rulers descended from the sky, beings who guide from beyond sight, families marked by contact or election. After a while, it becomes difficult to tell where the alien language ends and where older religious or mythic language begins, because the themes are so similar that they almost seem to be describing the same figures under different names, which is exactly where the story naturally turns next. Once people begin asking whether Nordic aliens are really extraterrestrials, the conversation almost always widens into something older. The question stops being only about UFO reports, contact stories, or modern witness testimony, and starts brushing against a much larger and stranger possibility. What if these beings are not entirely new to human experience? What if they belong to a category of encounter that has been with us for a very long time, only described in different language depending on the century, the culture, and what sort of explanation people found acceptable at the time? In one era, perhaps they were angels, in another shining visitors, in another beings from the stars, in another messengers, fair folk, radiant strangers, heavenly intermediaries, watchers, teachers, or divine envoys. The labels change. The face, interestingly, sometimes does not change quite as much as one might expect. This is where the Nordic alien story becomes more than a branch of UFO mythology. It begins to touch the old human archive of near-human beings who seem elevated, beautiful, calm, and not quite from here. Once you notice that pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee. Across different traditions, there are repeated figures who look enough like people to communicate with people, but whose presence carries something extra. They are taller, brighter, cleaner, more composed, more balanced. They appear with certainty. They often speak with authority. They may offer warning, guidance, or judgment. They may inspire comfort or fear depending on the encounter, but they rarely feel ordinary. And most importantly, they are often remembered less for what they did physically than for how they made reality feel altered around them. Take angels, for instance, though one has to do so carefully. Angels in older religious texts are not always the soft, decorative beings later art turned them into. They can be alarming, severe, and overwhelming. In some accounts, they appear as terrifying manifestations, not gentle blonde visitors in immaculate tunics. But in many traditions, especially in later retellings and visual culture, angels are also rendered in a much more human-adjacent way. Radiant men, beautiful figures, luminous messengers, calm strangers appearing suddenly with words of warning or reassurance, human enough to converse, other enough to command immediate attention. That overlap with the Nordic image is hard to ignore. Not exact, certainly, but emotionally close. If a witness in a pre-technological age encountered a tall, beautiful, glowing, human-looking being who communicated directly and carried a message about the state of the world, the word angel would not be an unreasonable choice. If a modern witness had an encounter with the same figure near a strange light or in a UFO-shaped cultural context, the word alien might feel just as natural. That does not prove these reports describe the same kind of being. It does suggest that human interpretation may be doing a great deal of work. People name what they encounter using the categories available to them. A person in the ancient Near East did not have 20th century extraterrestrial language waiting on the shelf. A person in the middle of the flying saucer era did. If the underlying experience involves a powerful presence, a sense of contact, a human-like figure that seems beyond ordinary humanity, and a message that feels morally or cosmically significant, the label may shift with culture, while the structure remains strangely steady. The same is true when people start comparing Nordic-type figures to beings from folklore. European traditions, in particular, are crowded with stories of fair visitors, luminous strangers, beautiful outsiders, and noble beings who look almost human but carry an unsettling difference. The old tales of certain fairy beings, for example, are not always about tiny winged ornaments for gardens. Many older accounts describe tall, elegant, beautiful presences who can charm, guide, mislead or transport humans into altered spaces and altered states. Time behaves oddly around them. Emotional perception changes around them. They may seem benevolent or dangerous or both, sometimes depending entirely on whether the human witness understands what kind of situation they have entered. Again, the overlap is not perfect, and folklore should not simply be flattened into modern UFO categories. But the resemblance in function is difficult to miss. Human-looking but not quite human. Beautiful but troubling. Calm but not necessarily safe. Present in liminal places, associated with missing time, altered awareness, and a reality that feels only partially physical. It is almost enough to make one suspect that the human imagination keeps filing the same strange experiences under new administrative headings. There are also traditions of divine messengers or radiant beings in many parts of the world that fit at least part of the pattern. A teacher comes from the sky. A shining stranger arrives with knowledge. A figure who seems superior in body and demeanour gives instruction, then disappears. In some cases, these beings are explicitly called gods. In others, they are servants of the gods, lesser divine figures, or celestial emissaries. Sometimes they are culture bringers who introduce law, ritual, agriculture, writing, astronomy, or other civilizing knowledge. This is where the story becomes especially tempting for people who favour ancient astronaut ideas. They look at old accounts of sky beings and say that these were misunderstood extraterrestrials. The mainstream historian rolls their eyes at that move for good reason, because it tends to bulldoze symbolism, ritual context, and the complexity of ancient religion in favour of a single shiny explanation. Even so, one can understand why the temptation exists. There really are older stories of superior human-like beings arriving from above, carrying authority and changing human life. The fit is loose, but the fit is there. Now one must be careful not to become too enthusiastic and start treating every heavenly visitor from every tradition as proof that a blonde interstellar committee has been checking in on us since prehistory. That would be a bit much, even by the generous standards of late-night speculation. Still, the similarities are worth examining because they tell us something important about recurring human imagery. When people imagine an intelligence above them, especially an intelligence that is not openly monstrous, they often imagine it in elevated human form. Not always, but very often. More beautiful than us, more composed than us, more certain than us, more difficult to categorize than us. That may say less about actual visitors and more about the limits of our symbolic vocabulary. If we want to picture a superior but relatable being, this is the shape we tend to use. The Watcher idea also enters the discussion here, and that is another reason the Nordic figure feels older than it first appears. Across various mythic and religious systems, there are beings who observe humanity from a higher place, intervene selectively, and sometimes cross the boundary between their world and ours. Some traditions imagine them as protectors, others as rebels, others as morally complicated intermediaries who do not fit neatly into human categories of good and evil. The important thing is not the exact theology, but the recurring setup. Humanity is not alone. There are superior presences nearby. They look enough like persons to have intentions and relationships, but they remain outside the ordinary human field. They may guide, watch, warn, judge, or meddle. That is extremely close, at the level of narrative structure, to how many modern contact believers understand Nordic beings. One of the more interesting features shared between these older figures and modern Nordic reports is emotional effect. In both cases, witnesses or believers often emphasize not only what the being looked like, but how being near it felt. Time slowed. Fear changed shape. Calm arrived too suddenly. Awe took over. Speech became difficult or unnecessary. The being seemed familiar in an impossible way. These details appear in mystical literature, religious testimony, folklore, visionary experiences, and UFO contact narratives alike. That does not settle the question of what caused them. It does suggest that human experiences of the extraordinary may come with a limited set of psychological signatures, regardless of whether the interpretation is angelic, spiritual, folkloric, or extraterrestrial. Another overlap appears in the issue of beauty. This should not be treated lightly, because beauty in these stories is rarely just decoration. It signals hierarchy. A beautiful non-human being is not merely pleasant to look at. It carries an implicit claim of order, health, perfection, authority, and sometimes danger. Many older traditions describe celestial or supernatural figures as dazzling, flawless, or so striking that human observers struggle to meet their gaze. Nordic aliens are often described in a similar way. Their appearance is not random, it is elevated. That may be why the comparison to angels comes up so often. Not because the details match precisely, but because both figures embody beauty as evidence of otherness. They look better than ordinary humans, not because the universe is unfairly committed to visual hierarchy, though one occasionally suspects it, but because superior appearance is one of the easiest ways to convey superior nature. There is also the matter of location. Older supernatural beings often appear at thresholds, on roads, in wilderness, at night, in dreams, at bedsides, on mountains, in deserts, or in places where ordinary life already feels slightly unstable. Nordic encounter stories do the same. They do not usually take place under the fluorescent honesty of a busy office, where everyone can fill out incident forms together. They happen in liminal zones, the places where the normal world loosens its grip a little. That continuity matters because it suggests that the experience, whatever its origin, follows old channels. Human beings have always reserved certain times and places for the intrusion of the strange. When something appears there, we recognize it as belonging to a category even before we know what to call it. This is part of why some people think the alien explanation may be too modern and too narrow. They argue that the beings called Nordic aliens are simply the current face of a much older phenomenon, one that has never cared very much about our labels. In this view, whether people call them angels, fair folk, star beings, ascended masters, interdimensional intelligences or extraterrestrials is mostly a matter of cultural packaging. The phenomenon presents itself in ways that can be understood locally, but remains essentially the same underneath. That's a difficult argument to test because it is broad enough to include almost anything and elusive enough to avoid disproof. Still, it has one major strength. It explains why human testimony across centuries can feel oddly repetitive even when the official belief systems are different. The extraterrestrial interpretation, by contrast, insists on greater specificity. These are beings from elsewhere in the physical cosmos, or at least from another material environment adjacent to ours. Their human-like form may reflect shared biology, deliberate appearance, or some ancient connection to humanity. Their craft, technology, and contact behaviour belong to a modern space-age framework. This explanation has the virtue of being clearer, though not necessarily easier to prove. It fits the visual language of UFO culture and preserves the idea that we're dealing with neighbours from another world rather than updated mythic figures. But even here, the boundary is not as firm as it sounds. Many contact narratives blend spiritual and technological elements so freely that one begins to suspect the categories themselves are getting tired. A being appears in light, speaks telepathically, seems morally elevated, and may or may not arrive via craft. Is that an angel with unusual transport preferences, or an alien whose technology behaves like religious experience? The witness, understandably, is often in no position to sort it out. Then there is the idea that these figures are neither angels nor extraterrestrials in the simple sense, but something like archetypal intelligences, beings that emerge where human consciousness and whatever lies beyond it begin to overlap. This is the sort of explanation that sounds either thoughtful or suspiciously convenient depending on how much patience one has left. Even so, it tries to account for an important fact. Many of these encounters feel both real and shaped. Real enough to change a life, shaped enough to reflect culture. The witness is not simply inventing the event, yet the event arrives in recognizable symbolic form. A superior human-like figure appears because that is the form through which the mind can meet whatever is happening. Call it spirit, call it contact, call it a phenomenon dressed for local conditions. However one frames it, the old figures and the modern ones begin to look less like separate populations and more like different translations. It is also possible, of course, that the similarities tell us something much more ordinary. Human beings may just be remarkably repetitive storytellers, give us mystery, power, fear, awe, and a need for explanation, and we will reliably produce noble strangers, radiant messengers, hidden teachers, and superior humanoids with excellent posture. We have done it in religious art, folklore, science fiction, occult literature, and UFO testimony. Perhaps this is simply one of our favourite mental tools for organising the unknown. That explanation has much to recommend it. It is simple, psychologically plausible, and consistent with the way myths evolve. Yet it does not entirely erase the strangeness. If the same form keeps appearing because it is our preferred container for the beyond, that still tells us something important about how the human mind meets mystery. One thing it clearly tells us is that we want the unknown to remain speakable. A completely alien being is hard to relate to. It can terrify or fascinate, but it does not easily become a teacher, a judge, a guide, or a messenger in emotionally usable terms. A near-human figure can do all of that. It can look at us. It can talk to us. It can disappoint us. It can seem wise in a way we understand. That is why the Nordic image and older images like it remain so durable. They preserve relationship. They let the cosmos remain populated without becoming fully incomprehensible. The being is above us, but not too far above us to be imagined in conversation. And perhaps that is the real bridge between angels, star beings, and everything in between. They all solve the same problem. They allow human beings to imagine contact with something superior without losing the possibility of recognition. The messenger is not a beast, not a force, not a blur no mind can hold. The messenger is a person-like presence carrying more than a person should be able to carry. That is enough to make the encounter meaningful and enough to make it memorable. Whether the story is told in the language of heaven, folklore, esoteric revelation, or extraterrestrial contact, the basic emotional architecture remains remarkably stable. Still, the more these older figures begin to resemble the modern Nordic image, the more complicated the whole matter becomes. If the similarities are real and significant, then perhaps we are not dealing with a new phenomenon at all, only with an old one wearing updated language. If the similarities are only symbolic, then the Nordic alien may be one more modern vessel for ancient human hopes and anxieties. If there is some mix of outer event and inner translation involved, then perhaps witnesses across time have genuinely encountered something, but never in a form pure enough to escape interpretation. None of those answers is especially satisfying if one wants a simple conclusion. All of them, however, explain why the topic refuses to stay in the tidy little box marked UFOs and keeps leaning toward religion, myth, folklore, and psychology at the same time. And that is probably why the Nordic alien figure remains so hard to classify. It is too modern to be only ancient myth, too ancient in shape to be only modern science fiction, too human to feel fully alien, and too strange to feel merely symbolic. It stands in that awkward but fertile middle ground where categories blur and certainty becomes shy. The witness says it looked like a beautiful person, but not quite. The believer says it was a star being. The mystic says it was an angel under another name. The skeptic says it was a culturally shaped experience of the unknown. All of them may be arguing over the same silhouette, which leaves the next question sitting there quite patiently. If these beings resemble older sacred and supernatural figures so closely, why does the image continue to hold such power now, in the modern world? And what is it about the Nordic alien idea that keeps people returning to it whenever they need a face for hope, fear, and the possibility that the visitors we imagine most easily are the ones that look almost enough like us to be trusted? By the time a subject reaches this stage, after the encounters, the hidden presence theories, the bloodlines, the older parallels, and the emotional pull of the whole image, it eventually meets the thing that all durable mysteries must meet: proof, not belief, not pattern, not sincerity, not the strong feeling that something is there. Proof. And this is where the Nordic alien idea becomes especially revealing, because it survives in the exact space where proof is repeatedly desired, repeatedly approached, and repeatedly withheld. That is not an accidental detail. It may be the central feature of the entire subject. If people were asking only whether the stories were interesting, that would be easy enough to answer. Yes, they are interesting. They say a great deal about fear, hope, authority, beauty, and the way human beings build meaning around unusual experiences. If the question were whether witnesses seem sincere, that would also be easier. Many do seem sincere, not all, certainly. Every subject like this attracts hoaxes, exaggeration, fantasy, borrowed mythology, and people who enjoy attention more than accuracy. But many witnesses sound genuinely affected, even burdened, by what they claim happened. They do not present as cartoon performers from the outer edges of credibility. They sound like people trying to explain something that did not fit inside the normal furniture of their lives. That matters, yet sincerity is not proof. It never has been. And that is the first difficulty. Evidence in these stories is rarely absent in the dramatic sense. It is absent in the stable sense. There are stories, there are details, there are patterns, there are recurring descriptions, there are emotional effects, there are memories people insist they did not invent, there are supposed physical traces now and then, marks on the body, lost time, disturbed rooms, light seen by multiple people, strange impressions that last for years. What there usually is not, at least not in any way that settles the matter for long, is evidence that survives contact with ordinary standards. Something portable, something testable, something that can be examined by more than the witness, preserved, replicated, and shown without requiring a long preface about altered states, intuition, or why the camera unfortunately was not in an ideal position at the time. This is not a small problem. It is the problem. A mystery can live with weak evidence for a while. A mythology can live with it for centuries. But the closer one gets to claiming literal non-human beings are already here, interacting with people, guiding lines of history, or appearing in forms familiar enough to pass among us, the more the demand for proof becomes unavoidable. At some point, one cannot simply keep offering a beautifully arranged pile of impressions and expect the harder questions to remain politely outside. Something must hold under examination, or the belief remains what it has always been. Possible to imagine, difficult to establish. Of course, believers respond to this in several ways. One response is to say that the lack of proof is itself part of the phenomenon. These beings are advanced. They control the terms of contact. They appear when they choose, to whom they choose, under conditions they manage. If they do not want public confirmation will not happen. That explanation is clever because it protects the theory from the very absence that would otherwise injure it. No evidence appears because the beings do not permit it to appear. No public landing occurs because public revelation is not their method. No undeniable artifact is left behind because that would disrupt human development, or violate cosmic rules, or interfere with free will, or any of the other phrases that tend to arrive whenever mystery needs a formal excuse for remaining mysterious. Now, one must admit there is a certain elegance to this. It also happens to be extremely convenient. Any idea that explains missing proof by claiming the subject itself prevents proof has built a lovely little shelter for itself. It may still be true in principle. There is no logical law saying advanced beings must behave in a way that satisfies human skepticism. But the structure is dangerous because it can protect nearly anything from scrutiny. If proof would prove too much, then proof never arrives, and the belief survives in permanent suspense. Some people find that thrilling. Others begin to suspect that a theory so perfectly adapted to the absence of evidence may be drawing strength from exactly the wrong place. Another response is to point to the consistency of reports across time. Witnesses from different places, decades, and backgrounds describe similar beings: tall, fair, calm, human-looking, telepathic or nearly so, beautiful in a way that feels precise rather than casual, concerned with humanity's trajectory. Is that not evidence of some underlying reality? It is certainly evidence of something, but what exactly it supports is harder to say. Repeated descriptions can mean repeated encounters with a genuine phenomenon. They can also mean repeated cultural transmission. Once an image enters public imagination, later experiences tend to be described through it. That does not make every later witness dishonest. It means no report arrives untouched. The person has already inherited a visual vocabulary. They know what a Nordic being is supposed to look like, how it is supposed to behave, what messages it is supposed to carry, even what emotional atmosphere often surrounds it. The more recognizable the type becomes, the less useful repetition alone is as proof. This is one reason the subject remains open rather than solved. There is too much structure to dismiss lightly, and too little stability to confirm confidently. If the reports were wildly random, the whole category would collapse under its own inconsistency. If they were backed by decisive physical evidence, the matter would move out of speculation and into history. Instead, the Nordic alien idea sits in an irritatingly durable middle ground. There is enough form to suggest pattern, and enough looseness to preserve doubt. It is the ideal climate for modern myth, too coherent to vanish, too fragile to settle. Then there is the problem of perception itself. So many alleged encounters happen under conditions where human observation is least reliable. At night, in bedrooms, during waking transitions, in altered states, in moments of fear, awe, shock, paralysis, sleep disruption, emotional overload, or unusual environmental conditions. None of that means the experiences are false. It means they occur in exactly the territory where memory and interpretation are most vulnerable. A person may absolutely experience something extraordinary and still misidentify its source. A person may tell the truth about what it felt like, looked like, or communicated while being completely wrong about what happened objectively. This is not a moral failure. It is what it means to be a human witness rather than a recording device. Sleep paralysis is the most commonly mentioned skeptical explanation for obvious reasons. It can produce sensed presences, vivid figures, bodily immobility, strange light, pressure, intense realism, and overwhelming emotion. It can also create experiences that remain convincing for years afterward. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic states can be equally dramatic. Dreams can borrow the solidity of waking life with astonishing skill. Trauma, medication, stress, expectation, and prior belief can all influence how an event is remembered and narrated later. This does not erase every case, but it does crowd the doorway. Before extraterrestrials enter the room, many psychological and physiological possibilities are already standing there, holding tickets. Believers often answer this by pointing out that not all reports happen in bed, not all witnesses are sleepy, and not all cases fit paralysis or dream states neatly. That is fair. Some stories involve multiple observers, outdoor settings, unusual timing, or details that do not sit easily inside those explanations. But once again, that only returns us to the middle ground. This subject does not collapse completely under psychology, yet neither does psychology step aside and leave the field clear for alien contact. Evidence and doubt continue to live side by side, each strong enough to prevent the other from finishing the job. Physical evidence, when claimed, tends to suffer from another problem. It is usually either too slight or too contaminated by interpretation. A mark on the skin could mean many things. A strange memory tied to disturbed bedding proves distress, not necessarily visitors. Lost time is psychologically significant, but not uniquely alien. Lights in the sky are real enough as experiences, though notoriously difficult to identify with certainty after the fact. Photographs and videos in the modern world should in theory have made everything easier. Instead, they have made trust more difficult. A blurry image proves almost nothing. A clear image invites immediate suspicion of fabrication. Digital culture has given humanity many wonderful gifts, but it has not made the line between record and manipulation more relaxing. There is also the issue of witness selection. Extraordinary reports do not emerge from a vacuum. Some come from people already immersed in UFO belief, spiritual systems, or communities where certain interpretations are encouraged. Some come from people who only later enter those communities after the experience, which complicates matters. Some remain private for years because the witness fears ridicule. Others become public and then gather layers of storytelling around them, until one can no longer tell where experience ended and interpretation began. This is not unique to the Nordic subject. It happens in religion, folklore, conspiracy theory, and personal memory more broadly. The moment a strange experience is told aloud, it begins to change. Language organizes it. Audience shapes it. Repetition smooths parts and sharpens others. By the time researchers, listeners, or internet readers encounter it, the event has already passed through several filters. One of the most maddening aspects of the whole subject is that the strongest cases emotionally are often the weakest cases evidentially, and the cases with the most concrete detail are often the ones that feel most vulnerable to embellishment. A witness speaks with deep conviction, remembers the face for decades, feels their life was altered completely, and yet offers nothing externally verifiable. Another gives a more concrete narrative with dates, times, physical features and correlations, but the added specificity somehow makes the story easier to challenge rather than harder. The field seems built to deny perfect closure. It is always almost enough for believers and never enough for skeptics, and yet doubt does not finish the matter either. That is important. It would be easy and a little lazy to conclude that because proof is weak, the whole subject is merely fantasy. But human experience is rarely so neat. Not every mystery survives because it is empty. Some survive because they contain something real that remains badly understood. The difficulty is that real does not automatically mean extraterrestrial, and unexplained does not automatically mean impossible beings with excellent hair. There may be genuine anomalies in perception, consciousness, environment, or rare event structure that current categories do not handle well. There may be unusual psychological experiences that feel contact-like, because the mind, under certain conditions, produces encounters of astonishing depth. There may even be events that involve something external, but not in the tidy spacecraft and species way people imagine. Doubt is necessary, but if it becomes too proud of itself, it can flatten complexity into dismissal. That is part of what keeps the question open. The evidence does not compel belief, but the full body of experience resists casual contempt. One can explain many cases, perhaps most, through known human factors. Yet something about the persistence of the image, the emotional power of the reports, the repeated structure of the encounters, and the strange continuity with older forms of visitation keeps the subject from becoming trivial. Even when one suspects projection, one is still left asking why this particular projection recurs so effectively. Even when one suspects cultural shaping, one must still admit that culture keeps reaching for a very specific kind of being. Even when one leans towards psychology, psychology itself becomes the deeper mystery. What is the mind doing when it produces visitors so vivid, so morally charged, so oddly familiar? The burden of proof, then, becomes tangled with the burden of interpretation. Suppose a witness sees a tall, fair figure at the edge of the bed, feels sudden calm, receives a warning, and remembers it for life. What must be proven? That the event happened as experienced, that the witness is sincere, that no mundane explanation fits neatly, that the figure existed externally, that the figure was non-human, that the figure belonged to a larger class of beings. Each step is harder than the last, and many conversations fail because people argue at different steps without noticing it. A believer may say, "I know what happened to me." A skeptic may answer, "That proves nothing about aliens." Both statements can be true at once, which is not satisfying, but reality is under no obligation to be satisfying. Then there is the social problem. Public discussion of subjects like this is distorted by ridicule on one side and credulity on the other. Serious witnesses may stay silent because they do not want to become a joke. Less serious voices may rush in because the subject rewards performance. Genuine confusion gets mixed with fantasy, fraud, trauma, spirituality, and pattern-hungry speculation. The result is a field where raw material is abundant but trust is scarce. Once that happens, proof becomes even harder to gather because the environment around the evidence is already unstable. No matter what appears, someone has already decided it means too much or too little. There is also the uncomfortable truth that many people do not really want proof in the strict sense. They want meaningful uncertainty. Proof would collapse the imaginative flexibility that makes the subject so rich. If Nordic beings were decisively disproven, a certain kind of mystery would die. If they were decisively proven, the symbolic openness would also die. The topic would stop being a space for hope, fear, projection, identity and speculation, and become a matter for diplomacy, biology, theology, and probably several panicked committees. A solved mystery loses some of its imaginative power. One should not underestimate how much of this subject's endurance depends on remaining unsolved. It can be discussed forever because it refuses to close. This does not mean everyone involved is secretly protecting the ambiguity. Many sincerely want answers, but the ecosystem as a whole benefits from uncertainty. Books, communities, belief systems, spiritual identities, conspiracy frameworks, documentaries, testimony circles, and late-night questions all thrive where proof is incomplete. The Nordic alien idea is especially suited to that environment because it carries so much symbolic meaning even when literal confirmation fails. It can function as an external reality, an internal archetype, a modern angel, a misremembered encounter, a psychological event, or a coded metaphor for superior but uncertain authority. A concept that can survive in all those forms does not need decisive proof to remain culturally alive. Still, the absence of proof cannot simply be brushed away with poetic shrugs and a meaningful stare toward the ceiling. If one is speaking honestly, the problem remains severe. There is no public body of evidence strong enough to establish that Nordic aliens are real, in the literal sense most people mean. No verified specimen, no repeatable contact protocol, no artifact that settles the matter, no disclosed archive whose contents withstand scrutiny without requiring belief in an entire chain of hidden assumptions. That must be said plainly. Anything else would be dressing uncertainty and false confidence, and this subject has enough well-tailored confidence already. At the same time, it would also be dishonest to pretend that the whole thing is therefore worthless. The problem of proof may prevent a firm conclusion, but it does not cancel the phenomenon as human material. The reports, the imagery, the emotional patterns, the persistent recurrence of the same kind of figure, the way ancient and modern motifs overlap, the way people use this image to express hope and suspicion about superior intelligence, all of that remains deeply meaningful whether or not literal star visitors are walking the earth in perfect bone structure and suspiciously crease-free clothing. The absence of proof keeps the factual question open. It does not close the psychological, symbolic or cultural one, and perhaps that is the most honest place to leave it. Not with a neat answer, because the subject does not deserve one, and not with a lazy refusal, because the subject has lasted too long and touched too many familiar human nerves for that. The question stays open because the evidence never becomes strong enough to settle belief, while the experience and symbolism never become weak enough to dismiss. It hangs there in the middle, exactly where durable mysteries prefer to live, suspended between testimony and explanation, between the witness who says I know what I saw, and the skeptic who says that still does not tell us what it was, and somewhere in that suspended space the image of the tall, calm visitor remains, waiting for one last quiet look before the night moves on. By the time a mystery has lasted this long, the strangest part is sometimes not the mystery itself, but the way it continues to avoid becoming either ordinary or impossible. The idea of Nordic aliens has lived for decades in exactly that narrow zone, too specific to disappear entirely, too uncertain to become established fact, too familiar to feel completely alien, too strange to feel completely human. And once all the sightings, comparisons, theories, old parallels and questions about proof have been laid out, one quiet thought remains at the end of it all. If such beings are already among us, if they really do exist in the way some people believe, then why would they stay hidden? There are many possible answers to that, and none of them are simple. The first and most generous answer is that they would stay hidden because humanity is not especially good at handling enormous truth all at once. That may sound flattering to the beings and slightly unflattering to us, which is probably fair on both sides. Human history does not inspire enormous confidence when it comes to responding calmly to the unknown. We divide quickly. We mythologize instantly. We commercialize whatever does not kill us in the first week. We politicize things before the dust has even settled. We also have a long habit of turning every major revelation into several smaller arguments, most of them loud and poorly moderated. So if a superior non-human intelligence truly existed and had any interest in minimizing chaos, open public arrival might not look like wisdom. It might look like setting off a species-wide alarm while handing out matches. A hidden presence, in that version of the story, is not deception in the cruel sense. It is restraint. The beings remain out of sight because direct visibility would distort human development. If they arrived openly, everything would begin bending around them. Religions would react. Governments would react. Militaries would react. Markets, media, ideological movements, and every anxious cousin with internet access would react. The entire human future might begin organizing itself around the visitors instead of around its own difficult work. In that sense, staying hidden could be a form of refusal. Not refusal to help, but refusal to dominate the horizon. They remain near, perhaps, but not fully seen, because once a superior intelligence becomes publicly undeniable, ordinary human agency may begin to shrink in unhealthy ways. There is some logic in that. Children with all the answers handed to them do not become especially wise. Civilizations may not either. If humanity must grow, then perhaps it must grow without being overmanaged. It may need warning in fragments, nudges in private, signs at the edge of certainty, but not the kind of revelation that turns every human institution into a branch office for cosmic spectators. That would certainly keep the beings hidden for reasons that are almost ethical. They are there, if they are there, but they do not wish to become the centre of the human story. Or perhaps they understand that the moment they appear openly, the human story changes so much that whatever value they hope to preserve in it begins to vanish. Then again, there is a second possibility, and it is less flattering to everyone involved. They may stay hidden because they do not trust us. This explanation is harder to romanticize, though it has much to recommend it in strictly observational terms. Humanity is curious, inventive, warm, cruel, imaginative, generous, and deeply unpredictable, often before lunch. We build medicine and weapons with the same hands. We invent systems of breathtaking complexity, and then use them to argue with strangers about nothing. We can be noble in emergencies and ridiculous in comfort. Any species studying us at close range might reasonably decide that full visibility would be unwise, not because we are evil, but because we are volatile. A hidden intelligence could observe, learn, and influence selectively, without placing itself at the mercy of a civilization that has historically responded to difference with a mixture of fascination, conquest, worship, fear, and paperwork. That distrust would not even have to be dramatic. They would not need to think of us as monsters. It would be enough for them to see us as immature. Immaturity is often more dangerous than malice because it carries a certain innocence about consequences. A species that splits the atom before learning self-restraint, builds global networks before learning informational discipline, and can destroy ecosystems while arguing over definitions might not look ready for direct equal contact. Hiddenness, in that reading, is simply caution, not cosmic nobility, not divine patience, just practical caution. They stay concealed because to reveal themselves would be to step fully inside our confusion, and perhaps that is not a risk they are willing to take. There is also the possibility that the hiddenness is not a moral choice at all, but a limitation. People often imagine advanced beings as unlimited in power, because the alternative is less glamorous. But perhaps remaining hidden is not elegant strategy. Perhaps it is necessity. Maybe they cannot appear openly for long. Maybe direct contact is difficult, unstable, or costly. Maybe their form here is partial, projected, translated, or constrained by conditions we do not understand. That would explain why encounters are so fragmentary. Brief meetings, night events, altered states, threshold experiences. Not because the beings enjoy dramatic timing, but because dramatic timing may be all the opening they get. In that case, the hidden quality of the phenomenon is not chosen in the way a ruler chooses a policy. It is built into the mechanics of the contact itself. That possibility has an odd effect on the subject. It makes the beings less like omniscient guardians, and more like difficult visitors struggling to enter a world that does not easily admit them. Their appearances would then be limited by the same thing that limits proof. Contact comes through imperfectly. Memory catches only part of it. The human mind translates what it can. The event arrives distorted because clear arrival is impossible. If that is so, then the hiddenness is not a clue to their moral character so much as a clue to the architecture of the encounter. We keep receiving fragments because fragments are all this channel allows. Of course, there is a darker interpretation too. They may stay hidden because hiddenness is useful to them. That shifts the whole tone at once. A hidden being can observe without being observed. It can influence without accountability. It can guide without consent, if guidance is the right word, or manipulate without exposure, if one is feeling less charitable. Any intelligence able to pass among humans while withholding its true nature would occupy a position of enormous advantage. That advantage might be used kindly. It might also be used for purposes entirely their own. The calm face, the gentle message, the beautiful form, the quiet warning, all of it could function not as honesty, but as interface. If a superior being wanted access rather than understanding, appearing in a way humans find reassuring would be a very efficient method. This is where the subject becomes difficult to hold comfortably, because a hidden protector and a hidden manager may look very similar from a distance. Both avoid open rule, both remain partially unseen. Both influence selectively, both communicate in fragments, both leave humanity guessing. The difference lies not in style, but in intention, and intention is exactly what witnesses are least able to prove. The beings feel kind, some say. They feel peaceful. They seem concerned. But feeling is not evidence of motive. Human life already offers ample demonstration that calm voices can hide complicated purposes. There is no reason an advanced intelligence would be exempt from that possibility, simply because it looks graceful under odd lighting. Still, a completely cynical reading does not satisfy either. The Nordic alien idea has lasted too long precisely because it does not settle cleanly into threat. People do not only fear these beings, they also project longing onto them. That matters. A hidden visitor is disturbing, yes, but it is also strangely intimate. It suggests attention without spectacle, presence without conquest. That is one reason the idea has such bedtime power, if one can put it that way. It turns the vast silence of the universe into something quieter and nearer. Perhaps someone is here already, it whispers, not with banners, not with declarations, not with engines over cities, just here, watching, waiting, choosing moments carefully. For many people that thought is unnerving, for others it is relieving. The world feels less empty when mystery is nearby, even if mystery remains professionally unhelpful about confirming appointments. There is another reason they might stay hidden, and it may be the most humanly understandable of all. Perhaps open contact would change not only institutions, but ordinary relationships. Every person would begin looking at every unusual stranger differently. Beauty would become suspicious. Composure would become suspicious. Difference of any kind would become loaded with new significance. The social world would grow paranoid almost overnight. One can already see how quickly people assign hidden identities to those they find unusually charismatic, detached, or striking. Imagine what that tendency would become if a near-human extraterrestrial presence were publicly confirmed. The world would fill with false identifications, projections, fear, imitation, performance, and a great many very tiring conversations. Hiding, then, could protect not only the beings, but the ordinary fabric of daily life. That fabric matters more than most theories admit. Civilization survived not only through grand truths, but through small assumptions. The face across from you is human. The person in the next apartment is ordinary. The stranger on the train may be odd, but oddness belongs within the normal range of human oddness. The moment those assumptions crack, public life changes. People start reading one another as symbols, risks, signs, categories. Hiddenness may therefore preserve the everyday. It lets the world continue functioning without every public encounter becoming a scene from a very nervous speculative drama. If there are beings among us, perhaps they remain concealed because the ordinary world is more fragile than it looks. And yet one must also entertain the simplest answer of all. They stay hidden because they are not really there in the literal sense people mean. In that case, hiddenness belongs not to the beings, but to the phenomenon inside us that keeps producing them. The Nordic figure remains unseen publicly, because it exists most fully at the level where human longing, symbolism, altered states, memory, fear, beauty, hope, and ancient narrative structures meet. It appears hidden because it is not a public object. It is a recurring form through which the mind encounters the unknown. That does not make it trivial. Quite the opposite. It would mean the hiddenness is intrinsic. Such beings do not stand in town squares for the same reason dreams do not submit tax returns. They belong to a borderland between experience and explanation, and that borderland has never been a good place to demand clear identification papers. There is something quietly persuasive about that explanation, though perhaps not persuasive enough to make the whole mystery go away. The reason is that the Nordic figure often feels less like a random invention and more like a recurring answer to a recurring human condition. People want the universe to contain intelligence greater than their own, but not intelligence so alien that it cannot be spoken to. They want criticism from above, but not annihilation. They want comfort from beyond, but not loss of self. They want beauty to signal moral order, though experience keeps warning them that beauty has a complicated record in that department. So they produce, or encounter, or interpret a being that fits those needs with suspicious efficiency, hidden because it is symbolic. Hidden because it belongs to the inner theatre of contact more than the public square. Still, even that may not be the whole story. It is possible that the hiddenness endures because the phenomenon, whatever it is, works best at the edge of certainty. Some things lose their function when dragged into full daylight. Religion changes when everything becomes measurable. Art changes when everything becomes literal. Folklore dies when all mystery is turned into administration. Even human love becomes flatter when one attempts to reduce it to chemistry alone, though chemistry is obviously involved and often doing excellent work. Perhaps the Nordic alien idea survives because it occupies the one space where modern people can still feel visited without having to submit completely to either theology or bureaucracy. Too visible, and it becomes a policy problem. Too absent, and it becomes a forgotten fantasy. Hidden just enough, it remains alive. That may sound like a convenient defense of vagueness, and perhaps it is, but human beings have always lived partly by such vagueness. Not all truths arrive as facts. Some arrive as patterns that reveal what a culture fears, hopes, and needs. The hidden Nordic is a pattern of that kind, whether or not there is anything literal behind it. It appears whenever people begin to feel that humanity is both observed and unfinished. It appears when superior intelligence must be imagined as beautiful enough to trust and distant enough to obey. It appears when the night world feels close to populated, but the day world refuses to sign the paperwork. That persistence suggests that hiddenness itself may be part of the appeal. An open alien is a problem. A hidden one is a presence. Then there is the possibility that the beings remain hidden, because that is the only form of contact humanity can bear without reorganizing itself around worship. This may be the most awkward possibility, because it asks something rather embarrassing of us. Perhaps if such beings appeared openly, many humans would not respond with scientific curiosity or mature diplomacy. Perhaps they would respond with devotion, or panic, or imitation, or social collapse disguised as spiritual awakening. A being that looks almost human and yet obviously superior would trigger every old instinct toward hierarchy, sainthood, purity, fear, and power. Some would want to follow. Some would want to resist. Some would want to own the narrative. Hiddenness may be the only way to remain present without becoming an object of mass psychological dependence. This idea brings the whole subject back to authority, where it has quietly lived all along. The Nordic figure endures because it resembles a form of authority many people secretly wish existed. Calm authority, beautiful authority, corrective authority. An intelligence that sees our disorder clearly and is not itself disordered. That dream is deeply tempting. It is also dangerous. Perhaps hiddenness protects us from indulging it too easily. If there are such beings, perhaps concealment is the last barrier between humanity and its own urge to surrender complexity to a more composed face. A species that already struggles with charismatic leaders might not benefit from access to a genuinely superior class of them. Of course, one cannot say any of this with certainty, and perhaps that is the final point. The hiddenness remains because certainty never arrives. Every explanation leaves some remainder. If they are real, concealment might be protection, caution, strategy, limitation, or discipline. If they are symbolic, concealment belongs to the way the human mind stages mystery for itself. If they are some difficult mixture of outer event and inner translation, then hiddenness may be the natural state of a phenomenon that can only be met indirectly. In all cases, the veil remains, thin enough to imagine through, thick enough to prevent completion. That is why the idea lingers so well in quiet hours. During the day, people prefer stronger edges. They like explanations that can be sorted, indexed, mocked, defended, and argued into categories. At night, the mind becomes more tolerant of the unresolved. It can admit that some questions are interesting precisely because they refuse to become fully obedient. If Nordic aliens are already among us, then perhaps they stay hidden, because hiddenness is what preserves the possibility of contact without destroying the conditions that made contact meaningful in the first place. If they are not among us literally, then the hiddenness still tells us something true about the human wish to be watched by intelligence that is wiser than our own, but still close enough to recognize us. Either way, the figure remains where it has always been. Not fully in the sky, not fully in the mind, not fully in religion, not fully in folklore, not fully in science fiction. Somewhere near the threshold, standing just close enough to be remembered and just far enough to be doubted. And perhaps that is exactly the distance at which a mystery can survive for a very long time, waiting in the quiet with the calm expression of something that knows it does not need to step fully into the light to remain present.